Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississauga of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Well, thank you so much for coming to the 13th Annual Massey Grand Round Symposium, titled Healthy Aging and Living Forever. Happy Holi, Happy Persian New Year, Happy Spring Equinox. Speaking of spring, we're very excited to have everyone here. My name is Arsalan Mirmotadari, and this is my partner Kesh Sood. We have the honor of being chair and co-chairs of Massey Grand Rounds this year, along with our colleague Julian Lamana, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, and he sends his regards. For those who might be new to Massey to the college, Massey is an interdisciplinary college made up of junior fellows, which include professional students and graduate students of all disciplines, as well as senior fellows, which include accomplished scholars and eminent members of society. Together, we seek to form a rich and stimulating community. It is truly unique, congenial, and intellectual environment, a bit of which we hope to show you today. Massey Grand Rounds is a group at Massey College, mentored by senior fellow Dr. Avi Angel, with a focus on engaging the Massey community in intellectually stimulating discussions and facilitating the exchanges of ideas in health science, medicine. And we do this through monthly meetings as well as our Massey Grand Round Symposium, our premier event, where we gather distinguished guests, speakers, and panelists to discuss timely issues.
Thank you. We'll just switch spots. That's great. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. This Massey Grand Round Symposium is especially special because it is not only the 13th, and 13th is a great number, but it actually features our very first Janet Rossant lectureship. So this year, we actually have the pleasure and honor of establishing this lectureship with Dr. Lory West in conjunction with our yearly symposium, which is entitled The Healthy Aging, Living Forever. Now, this is the biggest symposium of the year, and what makes it especially special is this kickstart of this lectureship series. So, the Janet Rossant Lectureship was established at Massey College in recognition for Dr. Janet Rossant, who is here today as well, and her distinguished career as a scientist, scholar, builder, and leader in medical research. Her dedicated mentorship of young scientists and scholars is reflected in the purpose of this very honor. This award will attract accomplished scientists to engage graduate students and faculty members alike as a part of the Massey Grand Rounds program. Each year, we go through a very rigorous and exciting process of finding a topic that is both current, significant, interdisciplinary, and one that can engage a very broad range of our Massey community and the greater community at large, including the University of Toronto. Not just those directly related in the health or medical profession, which is what makes this entire symposium especially exciting. We talk about current and new-aged health topics for members of our community who may not be in health professions themselves. So we go through this in-depth discussions and debate throughout the term with members of the MGR Society and the college. And this year, one topic rose to the very top, which was healthy aging. Who knew? We all have this one thing being in common, being mortal. So, okay. Well, with the advent of technology, we do have higher standards. Yeah, that sounds great. Great idea. So with the higher standard of living in society in this digital age, Canada is preparing for the largest aging population of its history. Just to give you some numbers on this, in 2011, 2.2% of Canadians were over 85 years old. I'm sorry. And so apart from being 85 years, Canadians that were 85 years and above represented 2.2% of our Canadian population. But by 2016, this number rose to 19.4%. So that's right, you heard that right. 1 in every 5 Canadians is roughly over 85 years old. Now, what makes this especially magical in Canada, centenarians were the largest growing group of this very population, and those are defined as people that can actually live over 100 years. So not only does Canada have a very high standard of living, we have almost an increase in the aging population more than other national communities as well. So, with the help of our distinguished speakers, we hope to examine the biological, the economic, and the public health implications for our growing aging population. We will explore the molecular basis of aging. We will understand the importance of the social supports and also gain insights into living better, stronger, and longer. So today's program includes a diverse faculty of experts addressing multiple aspects of current research and interventions, including biomedical, clinical, and public health interventions. We hope that you will join us to learn from the plenary keynotes and also the panel discussion happening later this afternoon about the potential socio-cultural, clinical, economic, and ethical implications of living stronger.
Of course, before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank some very important people for making this possible, including Principal of Massey College, Principal Hugh Segal, the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Dr. Trevor Young, the Chair of the Department of Medicine, Dr. Gillian Hawker, and former Dean of Medicine, Dr. Kathy Whiteside, and of course, MGR member and our Senior Fellow and Order of Canada recipient, Dr. Avi Angel, who without this wouldn't have been possible. So before we begin, I'd like to invite Dr. Avi Angel up to the podium to give a few remarks. Dr. Avi Angel.
As you heard, my name is Avi Angel. And I'm delighted to be here.
You're getting feedback from the other mics.
Competing with this feedback.
Everything's about positive feedback.
Good morning. Principal Segal, honored guest, Lory, and Janet. It's a pleasure to be here celebrating the 13th annual gathering of the 2019 Massey Grand Round Symposium. I should start off, as I have in the past, by paying tribute to our founding MGR leaders, and here's a photo of the inaugural
Is the machine on? There you go. Go back one. There you go.
Good. Excellent. A photo of our inaugural meeting of Massey College Grand Rounds in April 2006. You may not recognize these alumni, but all have important jobs in universities and hospitals across the country. They are Dr. Fiona Menzies, who's one of our panelists today. I don't know whether she's here in the audience yet, but she will be here. Martin Betts, Jay Shaw, Janice Wong, John Neary, Lory Waters, Andrew House, and Dr. John Dirks. Their legacy prevails. Over the years, MGR has organized annual symposia on topics of interest to junior fellows and the University of Toronto as a whole. I draw your attention to our most impactful symposium that resonates to this day.
What's a little suspense?
He needs a projectionist. He needs a projectionist.
Good. Resonates to this day. We note with sadness and dismay the stressful challenges students face in the university setting. In 2015, we addressed the science of stress featuring General Romeo Dallaire in an effort to draw attention to the students' despair, its causes and consequences. The tragic suicide of a University of Toronto student last Saturday, apparently the third this academic year, drew outrage in our student community, leading to a major demonstration and sit-in on Monday at Simcoe Hall. As this issue continues to unfold, we hope for appropriate interventions. President Merrick Girdler was on CBC this morning and expressed sympathies and renewed commitment to mental health support at the University of Toronto. This year, MGR wanted to discuss how this works.
Somebody needs to do it for him.
Ursula, just do it.
Just do it for him.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
This year, MGR wanted to discuss looming problems confronting our aging population. Aging well is everyone's hope, and lifestyle choices are important determinants. Chronic diseases are being tamed, infectious diseases eradicated, and genome science has offered highly specific targets for intervention and possible cures. We must ensure there will be fair access to these advances, particularly in the frail elderly. There are cost implications, and this is a real challenge. The program this year is enhanced significantly with the addition of a named lectureship and honors two extraordinarily accomplished leading-edge Canadian scientists. Dr. Janet Rossant, President and Scientific Director of Gairdner Foundation, whose name is enshrined in the award, and Dr. Lory West, the inaugural lecturer, who is here today to give the lead talk. Congratulations to both of you. Thank you for coming. We're grateful and honored that the Janet Rossant Lectureship was established and is integral to part of Massey Grand Rounds. The success of Massey College Grand Rounds as a program depends in part on the commitment and interest of the Senior Fellowship. Senior Fellows over the years have attended monthly MGR dinners and engaged the Junior Fellows with their personal histories of achievement, their vision, and friendly advice. They constitute our College of Mentors. This slide lists the names of all the Senior Fellows who have graced Massey College Grand Rounds dinners. You'll find your name there. Those with the asterisks have had multiple visits, and the names in blue are this year's panel of guest mentors. Finally, I draw your attention to the program in your hand, which was developed by the MGR Organizing Committee, as mentioned, and featuring an extraordinary group of U of T faculty with important messages grounded in the scientific basis of healthy aging. Welcome to the scientists and teachers, and thank you for giving your precious time and commitment to this endeavor. My last slides recognizes the principal sponsors for underwriting the Massey Grand Rounds and the Symposium. A very special thanks to Principal Hugh Siegel, who's been a stalwart supporter and guide. Dean Trevor Young, the Faculty of Medicine, and Gillian Hawker, the Department of Medicine, University of Toronto, and as mentioned before, Dr. Kathy Whiteside, who sustained our program over the years. The Friends of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and Diabetes Research and Treatment Center is what I'm affiliated with, and my time is supported by them. It's now my pleasure to invite Principal Hugh Siegel to the podium for his words of welcome on behalf of the college.
So I'll be very brief, and I don't use slides. I think there's certain things that men over 50 should not do in public. And one of them is PowerPoint, as a gentleman. Let me say that this is my 5th and final year as principal here, and I can't think of any event at Massey College that has been more inspiring to me than MGR and its activities over the years. It represents the very best of the notion that if you get really great minds together from different disciplines, both within the health sciences and beyond, you produce better results, better questions, and you also produce for the Junior Fellowship remarkable networks of people that then become part of their pathway to life, where they make their own choices and make the world a darn sight better than the one they inherited from us. So for Massey, this is one of those events that really speaks to the essence of our purpose, and I cannot say a word of thanks that is substantial enough to the mentor and leader of this exercise from the Senior Fellowship. Aubie has been, as you all know, pleasant, kind, thoughtful, and absolutely relentless in pursuit of this activity, and we are all beneficiaries of that. And while I will never address this particular gathering, again as principal, I hope to be sitting where all of you are for many, many years to come as a senior fellow to enjoy the continuing work. And you're all always welcome at Massey College. Thank you all very much.
Now,
sunlight from this.
now we'd like to welcome the Dean of Faculty of Medicine, Dr. Trevor Young, to take the stage.
No, I was going to give a couple of comments, so thank you very much. I'm going with the principal's recommendation, no PowerPoint slides over 50. 50 was actually quite a long time for me, so I'll just end that comment there. But again, thank you, thanks to Avi for his wonderful mentorship and really making sure that every year these Massey Grand Rounds are really a tremendous event for us to really enjoy and learn a lot. To our principal for his support of this endeavor, and of course to our co-chairs, Arslan, Keshna, and Julian. What a great theme. I can't think of anything which is more helpful. And when we did talk about the idea, it was kind of course it's obvious that aging is important, but I think they were able to craft a topic within it which was going to be a great benefit to our understanding. Really looking forward with hope, I think, rather than despair at some challenges. How do we address particular challenges? How do we keep healthy people at home? How do we keep people healthier longer? How do we use technology? How do we look at our amazing rehab sector and engineering colleagues? How do we use those advances to help us live not only longer, but live well too? So I'd just like to end by saying a couple of welcomes to Lory West from the University of Alberta, really a world leader in the area of heart transplantation and transplant immunobiology, who will develop, of course, who will deliver the inaugural Janet Rossant lecture. We are all huge fans of Janet Rossant for so many reasons that I'm sure we all share. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I'll be back to share one of the symposium after, but really looking forward to the wonderful events that are happening here today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for those very kind words, Dr. Trevor. We'd just also like to extend on behalf of the MGR team, the Dean of Medicine, Dr. Trevor, was very instrumental in crafting this final symposium topic. He offered a lot of his time and insight into figuring out where in aging we want to take the symposium and which ideas about aging or surrounding the sociocultural and clinical issues around aging really come forward. So thank you for your time.
Now we'd like to take a moment to introduce next speaker, Dr. Lory West. Well, actually, sorry.
Yep.
Dr. Janet Rossant. To make a few remarks. So Dr.
Okay, Arslan's just kidding. We were just checking if you guys actually read the brochure and stuff like that. So you guys read it, great job. So now it is the lovely time for the moment we've all been waiting for. Dr. Lory West will share a bit of her insight with us. Thank you.
So as a woman over 50 years of age, reasonably confident in my PowerPoint abilities, although my husband did help me out a little bit.
That's going to be another line.
We're going to go back.
Unless there's a graph or something like that, but you have to have a, I don't know.
It was up there for a moment.
I hope the sound works. What a great pleasure to be here. It's a sunny day, it's a spring equinox, it's just wonderful to be here. And I'd like to start just by thanking Principal Hugh Siegel, Avi Angel, and the other organizers who have put this together. It's really a very great honor to not only be involved, but an especially great honor to be delivering this particular lectureship in honor of one of my great heroes. So, and it's also very interesting to see that aging begins at the very beginning. When we start with the early phases of development, and we know more and more that that many of the implications later in life of early events in development are really very important at setting the stage for both healthy and non-healthy aging. So I'm really pleased that we can start at the very beginning. As I said, it's a wonderful honor to be to deliver the inaugural Janet Rossant Lectureship. As we recalled last evening, we left Sick Kids in 2005, my husband and I, to go to the University of Alberta, just when Janet was coming on to lead the Research Institute. And I'll confess for the first time that, you know, I did have this twinge as we sat and chatted just before we left that, oh, maybe we should stay. But alas, it was not to be. But over the years since then, it's hard to believe it's 14 years since then, of course, like everyone else, I've watched the continuation of the amazing scientific contributions that Janet has made to the field as a wonderful scientist, a vibrant scholar, a committed educator, and an all-around enthusiast of life and science. So thank you very much for this honor. I'd like to, an overview of the things that I'd like to talk about today are, I'm very interested in interfaces. So the discussion about what we can do in an academic environment that brings in people from many different areas is of great interest to me. And so I'd like to just present a view of academic medicine and the importance in particular of clinician scientists. And then I'd like to sort of take you through a story that starts with a clinical problem, links it to a laboratory model, and links basic research with human medicine. And then a way of moving forward when hard decisions have to be made as to whether and how one might be inclined or need to challenge established clinical dogma, and how we can learn from science the best way to do that. And then into the future, I'd like to share, if I can with you, some work that we've done recently on a national and international level as to the power of creative collaboration in team science. So beginning with transplantation, beginning actually before that with mentors, and I will call them sponsors. To me, I mean, we all know the importance of mentors. Of mentors and mentorship. They're of critical importance, but equally important are sponsors who not only work with you, work through problems, work through your particular issues, but open doors for you. And these I'd like to call sponsors. And I've been very fortunate in my career to have a number of people who've done this for me, have worked with me to actually help move forward. For women in particular in science, I think this is very important and perhaps under-recognized as an obstacle sometimes of moving forward to not have effective sponsors as well as mentors. So my first clinical mentor here, George Emanuelides, this Greek pediatric cardiologist, was a leader in pediatric cardiology and neonatology before those were developed into strong fields. He's teaching me how to read the coffee grounds of Greek coffee here, which I still do to this day. Now, Dr. E, as we all called him, was one of these amazingly enthusiastic people who just dragged you along everywhere. When I was a pediatric resident at UCLA, he took you into the operating room, and he was so short he had to stand up on a stool and hang over the operating room table, and he just was vibrant. And so lots of people went into pediatric cardiology as a result of the enthusiastic mentorship of Dr. E. He had trained at Sick Kids. And so I came to Canada then because I wanted to be part of that same training. I then had very important, not only career but life mentorship from my dear husband who's here. This is Dr. Jeffrey Smallhorn, and here's someone who, at a time when I really needed advice, spoke from experience as a very successful academic himself. I mean, who at the age of, 29, has three articles, publications in the same edition of the BMJ. You know, I mean, he was he got the academic part of it. And he said to me, as I thought about what I would do when I finished my fellowship here, because it's not enough to be a pediatric cardiologist anymore, you have to be a subspecialist. He said, well, when I decided to think about transplantation, he said, to establish credibility and move the field forward, you need to pursue the very best training you can. And if that takes you overseas, so be it. So I headed off to Oxford. I didn't come back for 4 years, but I don't think that's quite what he intended, but he was a great support to me. The scientific mentorship that I then was able to find at the University of Oxford in a program that was led by an Australian professor, Sir Peter Morris, together with basic science immunologists such as my own supervisor, Catherine Wood, really gave me the ability and started to show me that learning the tools of science through the lens of a clinician, initially, because I trained initially in clinical care, was of critical importance and really fundamentally altered what I would be able to do as a clinician scientist. So these were the formative years. So if we then go to my view then, some years later, when I came back to take on the directorship of the pediatric heart transplant program at the Hospital for Sick Children, sorry about that, I thought I turned it off, was this idea that there's really, if you're starting from clinical care, there's a circle of activities in academic medicine. And it may be the starting point for you is clinical care. Not for everyone, but for me it was clinical care, clinical problems. And these problems would arise, and then through the power of research, we could then find answers and solutions to these problems. And through the process of education, we could then use these to implement clinical change. And then, of course, the circle goes on, and there are new clinical problems, and it goes around, and it never really stops. Understanding, however, that this can also be driven in unexpected directions by the fundamental importance of curiosity. And of course, that has to inform then and provides valuable insight as to how these things proceed, because it's not all, I'm a great believer in the importance of curiosity-driven research and where it takes you that you may never have thought it would. And I may give you some examples here. So transplantation, if we just start with general organ transplantation, it's important to realize that this is not the transplant. We often focus on the surgical procedure. Here's the transplant. How many transplants were done this year? But it's a very interesting field of medicine because it starts with one disease, and I'm talking about all of organ transplantation now, and then generally one leaves behind the organ that has failed. So we come from a background of cardiology or hepatology or nephrology. We leave that behind. There's the transplant, the piece that gets all the attention, the surgical procedure, and then almost different from other fields of medicine in some ways, you take on a whole new disease, and you have a chronic disease for the rest of your life. And that often has more commonality amongst the organ groups of organ transplantation than patients before transplant. And that's a very helpful thing. And unique in medicine is the donation piece. So this brings in amazing issues related to altruism, to fundamental humanities, to philosophy, to law, to ethics, that are really quite different than any other field of medicine. And so it's a very rich environment for working and asking questions. In December 1967, a decade after the first successful human kidney transplant, the first human heart transplant was performed. And this, as I'm sure everyone knows, was performed by Christian Barnard in Cape Town, South Africa. It's widely acknowledged, however, that he was not the scientific powerhouse behind transplantation. He's the one whose name you remember. But he kind of usurped all the decades of work done, particularly by Norman Shumway, who really set the scientific stage, not only to understand and see how the physiology of the organ was important, and we needed to know that it would work in one individual to another, but the immunology was key to outcomes. And really he was unfortunately usurped by Christian Barnard, who came and watched for a few weeks and then went back and unexpectedly did the first human heart transplant. The other pioneers, though, with Norman Shumway at Stanford University were Bruce Wrights, also at Stanford, Terence English in the United Kingdom and in Cambridge, and Christian Cabral in France. And these were the early pioneers who did a lot of work in the science of heart transplantation. But although the title of this talk is a success, it wasn't a success in the beginning. In fact, it was a dismal failure. And between 1967 And by 1971, there was a general moratorium on performing heart transplants around the world because the results were so poor. The clinical results were poor because there was really, at that point, there weren't effective immunosuppressive drugs that weren't also highly, highly toxic. So either you died of graft failure, or the transplant failed, or with the kinds of heavy-handed immunosuppression that was available, the patient would develop overwhelming infection and die of infection. And heart transplantation, unlike kidney transplantation, when the graft is lost, the patient is lost. And so it's a bit different when you consider the risks and benefits of the various things that we can undertake. We can't go back on dialysis generally, so a patient loss is a death. Graft loss is a death. So in terms of pediatrics, in the late 1980s, there were very few options for babies with complex congenital heart disease. Heart transplantation was beginning to be applied. By that time, there had been a resurgence. Cyclosporin was around, better immunosuppression, and heart transplantation was a vibrant option again. But in pediatrics, partly because of the size of the patient, the size of the donor needed, and the complexity where adults generally are transplanted for diseases of the muscle of the heart, either because of cardiomyopathy or the sequelae of coronary artery disease. So you've got a relatively homogeneous population. In pediatrics, the large majority are from complex malformations, congenital malformations of the heart. And it was not applied to infants in the late 80s when I was still taking care of these fragile little tiny babies, as you can see in this picture here. And what I was struck with as a fellow and as a trainee was when children had hypoplastic left heart syndrome or other forms of complex congenital heart malformations, there almost seemed to be complacency. There almost seemed to be a collective kind of shrug. Well, what can we do? They've got lethal heart disease, nothing to be done. Which seemed really tragic to me as we tried to look after these tiny children. One man changed that, and that was Len Bailey. So Len Bailey still is a cardiac surgeon, a pediatric cardiac surgeon at Loma Linda University in California. Magdi Yacoub had carried out actually the first reported infant heart transplant in the world, and that child lived for 14 days. But Leonard Bailey shocked the world later that year in 1984 by performing an infant xenotransplant with the heart from a baboon at a time when xenotransplantation was broadly felt not to be ready to move into prime time. But he reasoned that the immaturity of the infant immune system would overcome the very large immunologic barriers that would result in rapid transplantation of a xenograft. This baby Faye, it attracted incredible controversy around the world. The baby died about 3 weeks later, and Leonard and I have had many conversations about this over the years because he argued that because of an unrecognized blood group incompatibility between the baboon donor and the infant recipient, that she died of ABO incompatible related transplantation, which I then came later to argue about. But in the end, I think we reached an understanding of what might have happened to her, which we can talk about later. But single-handedly, Len Bailey weathered the storm and opened the doorway to the fact that infants could be transplanted, that surgical approaches could be dealt with, and he personally performed probably 200 infant heart transplants when no one else in the world was doing them through the late 80s and early 90s. And he really opened the doorway. Here's his oldest infant heart transplant survivor, now 33 years old, transplanted at a couple of weeks of life. Doing well in Southern California. And as we've accumulated more information about infant heart transplantation, we can see from this data, registry data from the International Society of Heart and Lung Transplantation, that infants actually have those transplanted as infants have better outcomes than heart transplant recipients transplanted at any later time in life. So I believe, as I've studied neonatal tolerance and the infant immune system, that he was right, that Len Bailey was right. He didn't have all the immunologic training to study this better, but I think he was right that there's something special and unique about the infant immune system that can be exploited for better clinical outcomes. So as we move on, so what is the clinical problem then that I personally took on as I was working at the Hospital for Sick Children? And I'd like to just point out that my clinical team is here. The interdisciplinary team have come today, who some of whom were around at this moment. So the clinical problem that I faced is still being faced, and that is the unmet medical need because of the very scarcity of donor organs. And for children and for infants, obviously this is compounded by the fact that if you have a 3-kilo newborn, there aren't that many donors who are going to who are of the appropriate size to be able to use as donors for these tiny babies. And so although we had better outcomes than any later time frame, it was nearly impossible to get donors. And at this time, so where do we look to increase donor, untapped sources of donor organs? So at this time, roughly 60% of infants listed for transplant would die awaiting a graft. We offered generally 3 options: nothing, go home, the baby will die; the second, a transplant without the likelihood of getting a donor; or the third was the palliative surgery that back in the late 1980s really was not very successful, is much more successful today. So what would be the untapped sources that we could think about for donor organs? Well, one says I'm a vegetarian. Any chance of getting an artichoke heart? So I came, this was after my work at Oxford, which I'll tell you just a little bit about, but I came as, and again, these interfaces are what I find really interesting. I was now an interface between cardiology and immunology. I understood more about immunology than most of my counterparts in cardiology, who were doing, other things. And so I began to think about, well, what about the blood group? What about donors of different blood groups? And so we began to think about that. And to tell you the end of the story first, this is Caleb Schroeder back in 2012. He was the very first patient in the world to undergo an intentional blood group incompatible transplant on Valentine's Day, 1996, which the press loved, of course. He was 3 weeks of age then. This was obviously at Sick Kids here. He was donor blood type O. He was blood type O and his donor was blood type AB. So let me tell you a little bit about this issue, the blood group issue. I'm going to engage some colleagues at 60 Minutes to explain some pieces of this because they just do it so well. This works. Yeah, I know, but you have to get the ticking part. Because it's not 60 Minutes, right? Oh, well, never mind. So tick, 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 tick.
There's a rule that must never be violated. When transplanting a heart, the heart must be compatible with the patient's blood type. A mismatched heart leads to rapid death. But every month, people die waiting for that magical matching heart. And those rare donated hearts that aren't matched to a patient are thrown away.
Well, so why is that then? So the science behind hyperacute rejection of ABO mismatched organs has nothing to do with blood. It has to do with the sugars that make up the ABO structures that are expressed not only on erythrocytes of the blood group system, but on the cells and tissues of the organs we transplant. And we all, unlike other kinds of antibodies, like HLA antibodies, we all develop so-called natural antibodies to the blood group structures that we don't express. So I'm blood group B, I make anti-A, and so on. These preformed antibodies are what cause the problem because they bind with those structures on the vascular endothelium and they elicit an incredibly rapid process called hyperacute rejection that results in widespread hemorrhage in the microvasculature of the organ and really a very rapid shutdown of the organ. So this is why the blood group barrier is generally not crossed in transplantation. Talk about organ rejection. This is somewhere where you just don't want to be. This is what a kidney looks like that's been transplanted in an unconditioned recipient across an ABO incompatibility, and you can see that it's just completely clotted up. In the heart, this would look like, on microscopy, this would look like this with an occlusive intravascular thrombus and widespread hemorrhage. So this is an absolute contraindication in heart transplantation. Again, because patients die if you lose the graft. So in kidney transplantation, this has been explored more, but in heart transplantation, this remains an absolute contraindication. So it would be silly then to think about this as a source of donor organs.
Antibodies in the blood are always on the lookout to destroy foreign tissue.
What did they tell you way back in medical school would happen if you transplanted a mismatched heart?
Get acute rejection. The organ won't work right away.
Patient dies. No doubt about it.
No doubt about it.
I could just play that little bit at the end over and over again. He's very sure. So this is hypoplastic left heart syndrome. Just a drawing you can see here. This was the most common of the lethal lesions that for which there was no option. As you can see on the left ventricle is very small and incompatible with life.
That fall, Dr. West met Rita and Harry Schroeder. An ultrasound showed that the fetus Rita carried had a malformed heart.
It was tough. Essentially what they were saying is that the left side of the heart hadn't developed properly, so it wasn't pumping. The ultimate outcome, of course, of that would be if it didn't work by the time he was born. Without serious medical intervention, he would pass away shortly after he was born.
Rita and Harry named their son Caleb. He was put on the waiting list for a new heart, but they couldn't find one to match his type O blood.
We weren't sure how long we would have with him. I mean, they projected hours, they projected days. So the hospital, the staff there counseled us and they said, take a lot of pictures. You don't know how long you're going to have him for.
So pretty grim, really, looking at this. So this is where we then kind of move, if we're going to leave Caleb for just a minute, and move into where research comes into this, and in particular the kind of research that I had been doing at Oxford. I was learning about the very young immune system, and Peter Medawar had won the Nobel Prize in 1960 for his work that talked about how the very young immune system learns what's self and non-self, and how it becomes tolerant of self structures. He wrote at a symposium, if an animal is exposed to antigen before it has developed the capacity to react against it, then the development of that capacity is delayed, and in the continued presence of the antigen can be indefinitely postponed, as he was talking about the mechanisms of this. Now, Peter Medawar had been a surgeon during the war and was very interested, this was before even kidney transplants had been done, and was very interested in skin grafts. But his contributions to the science of transplant immunology went way beyond transplantation into the understanding of the development of self and non-self and the reactivity to self and tolerance to, and the other way around. He also described that in this article in 1953 that tolerance could be intentionally induced in very young animals by administering the antigen during immunologic development. So I was interested, as I came from a background, there was a clear clinical problem. I was interested in whether this could be clinically applied, whether now what we know with infants and the ability to work with very tiny infants we could start to look at this, the clinical problems through the eyes of a scientist. And so the model that I worked with was very similar to what he had worked with. A neonatal mouse weighs 1 gram, gets an intravenous injection at less than 24 hours of age of tolerizing cells, and we go on then, and my work looked at transplanting hearts instead of skin grafts. In the work that we were supposed to be beating there, but it's not beating, in the work that we were doing to study tolerance. And what we tried to do then is say, well, how does the mouse compare with the human? What's the developmental spectrum like? And you could see that the neonatal mouse had a critical window of exposure to these antigens of about 4 days, after which it would take, except forever, a skin or a heart graft. It would be tolerant to it. And in the human, that critical window probably correlated to somewhere mid-gestation. And as it turns out, during weeks, well, much earlier now, but during that frame of pregnancy is when the diagnosis of congenital heart malformations can now be done in utero, much earlier now, as I say. So we began to wonder, would it be possible to prepare an infant for a transplant shortly after birth by intervening during this period of immune development? What we didn't know, though, in doing this work was whether that extended after birth. And so that's where we approach this clinical problem. We have good outcomes from infant heart transplant with no donors. We have a laboratory model that we understand allows malleability, but it doesn't seem to be applicable to humans. So could these come together we looked at it the right way, remembering that we left Caleb waiting for a donor. So the cycle continues then, and we develop some answers, and we then need to think about applying those clinically in a process of education and learning. And of course, to be receptive to this, you have to appreciate and value what you don't know equally as much, if not more, than what you do know. Because the greatest obstacle to moving forward isn't ignorance, it's the illusion that you know. It's the illusion of certainty. And so, really, you have to re-examine and, if necessary, challenge the assumptions that are known. So in infant heart transplantation, the rules and regulations for how to set up and do a transplant came from adults. They also came from kidney. So what was put in place for kidney transplantation in adults was adapted to heart when that was done, and then adapted to pediatrics and infants, unchanged. So the rules and regulations assumed that every transplant recipient would be unsuccessful to cross the ABO barrier because they would have these antibodies, and that would result in the problem that I described. It was never re-examined. But you have to do that in medicine. I think this is part of science that is more natural. I think this is just part of being a scientist. You're always questioning, always re-examining, going back to the source. But I think sometimes it's a little more difficult in clinical medicine to challenge those assumptions. What are the barriers? Well, it's always been done that way, so it has to be done that way. We do it that way because it's safe. And the very flawed, I think, approach is that with children, we have to be conservative and cautious, which is deeply flawed because these are some of our most vulnerable patients. So, again, the interface between medicine and science is very interesting, and if you look at it, the scientist works with questions and observations, controlled experiments, reproducible conditions, but not surprised not surprised if there are unexpected answers or fortuitous outcomes. It should be dispassionate. The data are the data. They're just the data. And if the data don't fit, then the hypothesis may be wrong. But in trying to adapt that to clinical medicine, it's very difficult. And the surgeon, especially a surgeon, I think, they seek certainty and assurance with regard to potentially risky therapies. And so, can we take what we know about the immaturity and malleability of the infant immune system to provide a solution to this clinical problem? Well, we looked at what was there and the rationale that we came up with to really explore ABO-incompatible infant heart transplantation as a way of getting beyond this lack of donors was something that had been known for a number of years, and that is that babies don't have antibodies to the blood group structures. There's a lag in the development of immunologic responses to sugars, such as the ABO structures, until well into the second half of the first year of life. We know that also from vaccine responses. Infants have a hard time mounting a vaccine response to polysaccharide structures, to pneumococcus, meningococcus, and so on. And it's hard to elicit it. So it seemed to us, given this compelling patient population, that this was a reasonable rationale for challenging the dogma of ABO-incompatible heart transplantation. Sometimes you have to take a risk. So despite the fact that this was against all accepted clinical practice, infants lack the mediators. There's no preclinical model here. We can't go from mouse to primate to clinical. But we have a very compelling patient population whose likelihood of dying without a transplant is 100%. And so this is what we did.
Surgeon Glenn Van Arsdale rushed the donor heart back and keeps it on ice until he's ready to sew it into Keenan's chest.
Clamps off. The heart should start beating soon. That looks pretty good.
So this is not Caleb. You probably noticed that it was Keenan. This is Keenan. When 60 Minutes arrived, they thought they would hang around till one of these situations, and they did. They were there when when this transplant happened, so they were able to film it all. So Caleb was the very first, as I said, the very first infant to receive a transplant. And we reported a few years later the first cohort of 10 infants worldwide who intentionally received these hearts, showing the proof of principle now in a clinical setting without a preceding animal model that the scientific rationale was correct, was completely correct. There were no surprises. And this could be safe in young patients without antibodies. Since then, this has been adopted worldwide. The latest country is Spain, who's taken this on last year. Spain has more donors than any other country in the world, and so for a lot of reasons. And so this can move forward. We think they've already moved forward very quickly with this in Spain. So this resulted in babies getting transplanted, a dramatic decrease in waiting list mortality, an ability to use organs that were discarded before, and changes to organ allocation policies around the world. So then what happens? Like, the baby grows up. What happens then? They've got this incompatible heart, and they grow up, and their immune system develops and moves beyond the susceptibility, the age of susceptibility for tolerance. So, well, as you can, I've told you the outcome already. They didn't suddenly develop hyperacute rejection. This was Caleb at age 2
That was 7 years ago. This is Caleb today. Caleb has never missed a beat. His type AB heart is pumping in his type O body. The transplant was a complete success.
It was an enormous leap of faith. And where was the faith? It was in the science.
Just the glasses. I tried to show the big hair pictures too, but life becomes more sensible. Okay, so what happens then? Why is he still alive? Why is he doing so well? Because the impact of introducing those foreign antigens, in this case carbohydrate structures, into the infant immune system turned out to do exactly the same thing in these babies as we had seen in mice. Now, we didn't work with carbohydrate antigens in the mouse models, but in this, when we followed these children, what we found was that starting again at the time of introduction, in this case, say A to O, we found that these children went on to develop antibodies to the, what we call third party, so the different, not the donor. So this is A to O, so the babies go on to develop anti-B antibodies normally, but they remained effective for as long as we've tested in the development of antibodies to the donor blood group. So this is bringing in the science and the scientific knowledge, or understanding, to understand the observations that we made as we followed these children, that they developed spontaneous tolerance because of the introduction to these antigens at a very early age. Now, we've gone on to study this, and I don't have time to tell you about the science that has now emanated from this, but we now understand more mechanistically about the B cells that seem to be deleted by early exposure to these structures. It seems to be related to the B cell co-receptor CD22, which is higher, expressed more highly in infant cells than later in life, and a number of important things. And so we've sort of taken it full circle to bring the science in. Now, but I really want to share with you what I think is the ultimate in knowledge dissemination. And that is, a few years later, when I have great fondness for British detective stories, and one of my favorite authors is Peter Robinson, who writes the Inspector Banks novels. And lo and behold, I was reading this book about this abduction of a child, and at the denouement, it's turned out that this child was abducted to be an organ donor. And he points out, well, even the blood groups don't need to match if they're newborns. I've researched that, and I thought, well, that's nature medicine. I mean, Peter Robinson's book. The word. Anyway. So these are, this is Caleb now, age 23. This is Ronald, who is one of the other recipients of that early age, is now an RCMP candidate. So these babies actually, generally speaking, these babies do very, very well. So before I move on to the things that I want to talk about, we could just say then that this quote from George Bernard Shaw is kind of interesting, that the reasonable man, I would say woman, adapts herself to the world, whereas the unreasonable person insists on trying to adapt the world to themselves. Therefore, really all progress depends on being unreasonable, I would say, which I tell my husband over and over again, and he says, no way. So we have to insist on making the world adapt and changing these rules and regulations that were never needed in the first place. So the future then, I'd like to just spend the last few minutes talking about what we're doing nationally and internationally and the future. So these are some of the things. Immune tolerance, eliminate the costs and consequences of chemical immunosuppression, improve immunotherapy. There's so much out there in immunotherapy for cancer now. And really for transplantation, it's the other side of the same coin. They want to turn off the inhibitory responses. We want to turn on the inhibitory responses. So there's a great deal of excitement in some of the work that's being done in cancer. We need enhanced access to transplants, waitlist elimination, either through increasing donation, but that's not going to be enough. We heard some good news in the budget yesterday about enhancing processes for organ donation, but we also need research that understands how to increase the use of otherwise discarded organs through tissue engineering, maybe regeneration, through these amazing machines. I don't know if you've seen these organ-in-a-box things. Instead of taking a heart and putting it in a bucket of ice and sending it from Halifax to Vancouver, where it is damaged greatly, there are now, through biomedical engineering, these machines that actually provide ex vivo perfusion to keep the organ at normal temperature and functioning with nutrients. And I should have put a clip in here because the lung one is just way cool because it's breathing as well as being perfused. And so these are opening doors for us to really have an impact on the ability to transplant. Xenotransplantation is having an amazing resurgence in the science of xenotransplantation as well. But the power of what we can do in transplantation, especially if we remember that it starts before, it continues through the transplant procedure, and then it then goes on afterward, is only, I think, achieved by linking together all the various pieces that have an impact here, that touch donation and transplantation. And so I'd like to just tell you a little bit about the Canadian National Transplant Research Program. So this was, it was launched in 2013 after a call for proposals from CIHR. And it's a coalition, really, of more than 100 investigators, together with patients, trainees, and more than 200 collaborators. Really, there are probably about 400 people now involved in the CNTRP. The research takes place at 31 institutions and universities in 9 provinces. Every clinical transplant program is involved in one way or another. And we were very interested in integrating the science, the research, across the life sciences. So all 4 pillars, as they used to be called, of CIHR, from not just basic biomedical and clinical science, but also health systems and policy, and population research, and increasingly transsector work, both in the NSERC fields as well as the humanities and social sciences fields. And it's constructed around 7 project teams and 4 core platform teams, so 11 teams functioning across the country, taking on work in more than 75 interrelated sub-projects. From the very beginning, we had to have an alignment of philosophies about how to collaborate. And in my experience, there had been, for networks across the country, there had been a tendency to have the Toronto project, the Montreal project, the Edmonton project, and so on. We didn't mandate a lot here because we invited the community in, and the only mandate was you can't work alone. We need to break down silos, and we need people to work together. And so every project is multi-site. Not only multi-site, but across pillars. And every project interacts with other projects. And so we viewed that the interfaces involved in this kind of a structure in Canada would create, we wouldn't be able to fund 150 or 200 investigators, but we could create a framework for collaboration that was supportive and helpful and would allow our investigators to become more competitive in other kinds of grants. We started with roughly $14 million over 5 years, and through this reach out, we developed a program that was worth about $40 million by developing strong and vibrant partnerships. We were mandated by the CIHR to bring together communities that had never had a history of working together. So solid organ transplanters across all the organ groups, bone marrow transplanters who come from more of a cancer and a hematology background, as well as the donation piece, which are, for deceased donation, are really critical care doctors. So if you bring all these people together, and then engage patients and families so that we now have patients as partners in research, not as subjects in research only, but as active partners, and they're throughout the structure of the CNTRP. They're not only, they're key members in the structure, helping determine the research priorities all the way through to carrying out the research. Because we believe that individual efforts could lead to collective accomplishments here. We've recently rebranded to the Canadian Donation and Transplantation Program to better represent what we can do with the donation communities. And with this mandate to link the three communities, as I said, we've really managed to bring together in a way that can understand and exploit the biologic commonalities, develop essential communication pathways that would bring new knowledge into dialogue that would inform policy and public and effect change. And the alignment, as I said, of philosophies, as one of our early career investigators said, my competitors have become my collaborators. And I think that was the most powerful thing that we could do for our trainees and for our young people. And so this unites all streams of research toward the common goals of increasing the availability of donors, access to transplants, longevity of grafts, and long-term survival. And we embedded basic science. We said basic science must continue to be a part of this. And so what you do is develop an inventory of assets of the whole community that can then be linked and shared by people who often never had the chance to work together before. And so we really develop these vibrant synergies that can take us from preclinical all the way to clinical and policy and beyond. But it's egos have to be left at the door. This doesn't work for everybody. It works and it seems to resonate with people who see the framework as a structure for the community. And we bring together then all these people in different ways. And we have a training core as well that's been very important to that. As I mentioned, these diverse pan-community partnerships are absolutely essential. And we realize too that partnerships have to develop all of them in an individual way. So we may have an industry partner, but it may be different than our health charities partner, which is different again from every other partner. But this helped us grow the program into something quite unique. So as we move on into our next phase, we've reshuffled our projects and things into 5 different themes, and we've linked them by the common cross-cutting things that we need all the projects to address. Sex and gender is one, both in the biologic and sociologic impact of sex and gender, as well as increasing capacity in our ability to study these by increasing opportunities across sex and gender. By encompassing the entire age population from, and this is where healthy aging obviously comes in, from the very youngest to the very oldest. By looking at specific issues related to our indigenous, rural, remote, and recent immigrant communities. There may be barriers to access for them. We know that in the indigenous communities, access to kidney transplantation and liver transplantation is severely impaired, and we need to understand it in order to make it better. And looking at policy, commercialization, and knowledge transfer. And so we built up these cores, which is what we're moving forward with now, that allow us to then support our researchers in a way that will help them become more competitive going forward. And so just to end, these themes here, we believe, will allow us to ensure that every donation opportunity is fulfilled, every graft is used to save lives, the grafts will last a lifetime, and transplantation will improve and extend lives. And so I'd like to just leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention and for this, allowing me to be part of this wonderful symposium. Happy to take questions if there are questions.
Sure. We'll open the floor because we have some extra time to any questions the audience may have.
Dr. West, first of all, thank you for a remarkable presentation, which was inspiring and hope-giving in many, many ways, and that I can't fully describe. You talked about people leaving their egos at the door, which is part of any professional interaction. What about institutional constraints? This hospital, that province, this jurisdiction, are they, we have a particular mix of those in Canada, which some might call rich, others might call problematic. What's your sense of how the different jurisdictions represented in your slide, the different professions, the different silos of medical treatment are engaging with the opportunity which you described so eloquently?
Well, it's an interesting question. One of the things we talk about, so this model has been, it's been adopted by, at CIHR loves this model. They use it as a template now. But internationally also, we've been asked to present this kind of way of working together. And one of the things that struck me early on was that compared to the United States, where they're competing for patients, generally speaking, we don't compete for patients. We have a single payer system, they say, but really we have 13 jurisdictions, of course, in Canada, but we don't have this competition up and down the road. We do have other kinds of competition, it's true, but in terms of this kind of structure, I think that this kind of a framework allows us actually to rise above the provincial jurisdictions in health that plague us from doing anything nationally, and actually people are remarkably, generally speaking, remarkably willing to collaborate. I think personally now, as a former American, now complete Canadian, I think this is something we do really well in Canada. And certainly many people have told us we could never do this in the U.S. We just, because we have our advisory boards are from all sorts of different places, and they say people just don't work together this way in the U.S. And I've thought a lot about that because we all have colleagues in the U.S. It's not that they're not collaborative, but I think the structures contribute to a competitiveness that we can rise above a little more easily in Canada. So it's not all gone. There are still egos and there are institutional egos, but I took it out of here now, but we have a coalition agreement signed by 31 institutions, which took 3 years to get done. That alone is really helpful because it sets the stage for all kinds of things that you might argue about. Data, IP, publishing, and so on.
So the concept of immune tolerance not by immune suppression, people talk about it for many other kinds, grafts, transplants. Weissman has been pushing this for a very long time, and yet in the adult system we still don't see this being moved forward. Why is that?
Yeah,
is it just too difficult?
Yeah, so
in the adult system?
the question about tolerance and the difference between the exquisite susceptibility of the immature immune system to tolerance, and how can we reach out in adults? So one of the interesting things to me when we brought these communities together was a conversation we had about tolerance with our bone marrow transplant colleagues as we were writing the grant for this, actually. And I looked at this thing and I said to them, that's not tolerance. We don't call tolerance that. In the solid organ transplant communities, we tie ourselves up in knots to define tolerance. And we say, well, you can't be on any immunosuppression because then it's probably not tolerance. Well, this is tolerance. Those babies are on immunosuppression. But they show us by their responses that they can't be explained by immunosuppression. So the first concept we had was we need to learn from each other about tolerance. And that's where the biologic commonalities and learning from each other, oh, this is what you mean, I understand that. In adults, one of the things that some of our BMT colleagues have told us, I know that's an ancient, but our stem cell transplant colleagues have told us is that, I forgot what I was going to say, that you can maybe reset the immune system. That maybe with some of the conditioning kinds of regimens that BMT recipients undergo, you could reset it, and maybe what you're seeing with the slow start and change in immune responses especially after a pediatric but not infant transplant, is maybe evidence that we could do more with this. There also, of course, is the important work that's been done, as you've said, for probably 30 years now by a number of people like David Sachs and other people who think that building a hematopoietic chimera in preparation for an organ transplant still has a lot of potential to it. And certainly the Harvard group has been doing it. There are several clinical trials now that are looking at actually doing just that, taking the power, for lack of a better word, of a chimera intentionally made in advance of an organ transplant. And there are a lot of practical considerations about how difficult that is, and it's not foolproof yet, but there's really some very good clinical work being done there.
fantastic. Just one last one.
I saw a doctor from Texas a year and a half ago at Mars, and he actually asked the question, does one really need a heart? Because his research, he was a coroner, heart surgeon for decades, was, I think, taking calves, young cows, and using the calf's heart actually as a temporary substitute, not permanent, but longer term. This would be for weeks or months, conceivably, for a patient. And he showed us examples of what that research. And leaving aside all the types of questions that raises, what gets to me is in 2019, biomedical engineering alternatives to transplantation, the artificial heart, electromechanical pumps, whatever you want to call it. And I'd just be curious, I'm sure that you're practicing research, if you've looked at the statistics from the post-2000 as to the numbers of heart transplants around the world and the numbers of artificial hearts that have been transplanted. Is there any sort of interesting statistical comparison?
Yeah, so first of all, I need to tell you I'm not a surgeon. I'm a cardiologist, just so the surgeons don't accuse me of false identity. Obviously, I work very closely with the surgeons. But the advent of mechanical circulatory support, which are these artificial hearts, has certainly changed the field a lot. There are some people who do so well with an LVAD, a left ventricular assist device, that they can't be bothered to come off the golf course to have a heart transplant. That's true. It's true. The technology has resulted in a wonderful quality of life in many cases, but not in all cases. And there are declining numbers of heart transplants in many places, but the thinking is it's not solely due to mechanical circulatory support improvements, but because the trend for donation after circulatory death has meant that we're not actually seeing as many hearts available for transplant because patients are allowed to proceed to a circulatory death. And that means that most of the time their hearts are not available to be used. In many countries around the world, this has resulted in dramatic increases in the availability of every organ but the heart. So there are complicated factors that lead to the decreasing number of heart transplants. For children, we've been very lucky over the past 5 or 6 or 7 years because of targeted funds through the NIH that have been aimed at developing ventricular assist devices and mechanical circulatory support of the size needed for these tiny babies. And we use those more and more now. But I think looking at the overall picture and being part of a symposium looking at 50 years of heart transplantation now, I think the general feeling is we are always going to need heart transplantation. Artificial hearts have many complications, including stroke and bleeding and many other complications. And the new kinds of sources of donor organs, such as regenerated organs and decellularized and recellularized organs and maybe 3D printing and all these other really great innovations may change, will certainly change what we do, but it's still going to be a transplant. And so it'll still have things that need to be done to support it. The science is evolving very rapidly. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, I think we'll finish the questions.
One last question.
One last, quick.
I'm not interested in molecular genetics. Just a quick question about there is now possibility of engineering some organs. So I was just wanting to know your perspective on how much the debate has gone about legislation of engineering of tissues.
Well, as I was saying, there's all kinds of wonderful tissue engineering that's going on that will undoubtedly change exactly how we transplant, but those will still be transplants of some sort, an organ replacement of some sort. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. West. We are truly honored to have you with us and really honored for you to be our first inaugural Rossant lectureship. It was truly an enlightening lecture. I'm sure everyone learned a lot. I truly did. And now, I get to introduce Dr. Janet Rossant. So the lectureship was established at Massey College in recognition of her distinguished career as a scientist, scholar, builder, and leader in the medical research. Her dedicated mentorship of young scientists and scholars is reflected in the purpose of this honor. This award, which was given to Dr. Lory West, will attract accomplished scientists to engage graduate students and faculty members alike as part of the Massey Grand Rounds MGR program. Dr. Janet Rossant.
Well, it really is a great honor to have a lectureship in one's name. And as has been said many times, it's nice to still be alive when the lectureship is going on. So it really is a pleasure. As you heard, there was a very complicated process that led up to the choice of this year's lecturer. Nothing to do with me, but I have to say, when I heard that it was Lory West, I was delighted because, as she said, when I moved to the hospital for sick children and took over the Research Institute in 2005, Lory was still there. This work that she told you about, the whole history of moving to these ABO and incompatible heart transplants, was one of the sort of inspiring stories that I learned about. When you start as a head of research, at SICKIS there are close to 250 different researchers, PhDs, clinician scientists, social workers, physiotherapists, and many different people doing research. My job was to sort of sort through and try to understand the breadth of research. And you always have your favorite stories. And this was one of my favorite stories because it's such a beautiful combination of science, curiosity, driven by a clinical need, and really research that's made a big difference. And as we see, it even turns up in detective stories. What more could you ask? So really, it's a great honor for me to have this lectureship in my name, and I'm so pleased to acknowledge Lory as the first Janet Rossant lecturer. And I think we have a little, which you know,
black box.
A little black box. You know what the black box is. We have a presentation for you.
Come stand here so we can get some pictures as well, simultaneously. This presentation.
It's not a bottle of whiskey.
It's not a heart.
Massey Grand Rounds to honor Dr. Lory West, Inaugural Janet Rossant Lecturer, Massey College.
Session of the MGR annual symposium.
Well, Peter's a
Please grab your seats, grab your drinks, and get ready to join us for the afternoon session.
Forever.
Yeah, that's the afternoon.
He's a researcher.
You can wear it.
I think this is a very sharp point, and it's like crystals. This is beautiful.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. It's really been a wonderful honor. If that's necessary. Thank you.
Or another volunteer will be sitting there, yeah, because they're going to have the camera.
Welcome everybody, let's get started. It's a pleasure to host our first of two symposia in this amazing sessions. The first one is healthy aging. We have 3 outstanding speakers, and I do want to acknowledge that they are all from the incredible Department of Medicine, and we have an amazing chair, Jillian Hawker here, and of course Kathy Whiteside, former member, and many other people. It's really a terrific department and really is a cornerstone of our whole Faculty of Medicine. And I think you'll see just by the examples of 3 of the 1,000 superstars in that department where we're going. So we have three talks, half an hour each. We'll hold questions till the end, so if you have a question, jot it down, and then we'll have a brief panel at the end. We first, and I'm just going to introduce each person, and then you can come up and do the, is half an hour good, or you want, it's 20 minutes each. 20 minutes each. 20 minutes, and then we'll have up to 20 minutes at the end. So first of all, Dr. Samir Sinha, who's the Director of Geriatrics, Sinai Health Systems, and UHN, and his presentation is entitled, How Could a National Senior Strategy Support Healthy Aging? Please come on.
So many thanks for the introduction, Dean Young, and it's great to be here today. It's a bit intimidating. Susanna and I, who both work at Sinai, said we didn't realize that former deans, current deans, our chair, and like basically all of our bosses were here. We thought we were going to have, exactly. So if we feel a bit intimidated, you can understand why. But this is a great panel. I want to thank Dr. Angel, who's been organizing this series for years, and really makes this a collaborative opportunity with the trainees here at Massey. So when Anvi calls, you always answer, number one, and number two, I was really touched when he said that, the students, not him, it was the students who actually said that we want to focus on healthy aging this year as our topic. So we had a great talk about who else and what's going on and would I potentially be interested in, that's why I'm here. And really to start off this section of talks with really thinking about, at a really high bird's eye view level. Why should we be thinking about a national senior strategy and why should this be supporting healthy aging? And if your first question is, do we even have a national senior strategy? The answer is no, right? So, that's a good thing to think about. Should we have one? But again, why could a national senior strategy help from that topic of healthy aging? So, when we talk about aging in our society, one of the things we often hear is the phrase tsunami. How many of you have heard the term tsunami used when we talk about aging? Yeah, a lot of hands go up, right? Now, how many hear the term triumph used? Yeah, exactly, right? So we hear tsunami being used all the time. We talk about the demographic tsunami. The elderly are going to bankrupt our country. This is a terrible situation we're in, right? And how dare they grow old and now cost all of us so much, right? But the thing is, anybody who uses the term tsunami, I don't think they're well versed in the issues of aging. And why is that? Well, here's a question for you. Have any of you heard about the baby boom? So if you heard about the baby boom, you may have suspected that we might get to this position that by 2011 we would start be aging. And we have 1,000 people in Ontario every day who are turning 65 and over now, right? This is a rapidly aging situation we have. And in fact, why I talk about triumph, right, is the fact that in 1900 our life expectancy as Canadians was 51 years of age, yet our life expectancy today is 82. So when you think about the greatest accomplishment we made in the 20th century, some people say we put a person on the moon. I think the fact that we almost doubled our life expectancy is something we should celebrate and acknowledge. But tsunami means, like, these things happen without warning. But again, baby boom, that's all I'm going to say. So then we go to the idea of, like, so how bad is this issue? Because why are we talking about aging as this whole demographic tsunami? When you think about our population, we know that only 17% of Canadians currently are 65 or better. It's a small minority. Why do we care about this group? Well, if you follow those demographic trends, we know that over the next 20 years, those who are 65 or better are going to double in numbers. Those who are 85 and older are going to quadruple. And in the latest census, does anybody know what the fastest growing age demographic is now in our society?
Centenarian?
Yes, centenarians, over 100, fastest growing group, right? So yes, this is upon us, and we're going to see population aging happening faster than by 2030. Just in over 10 years, 1 in 4 of us will be 65 or better. So here's the challenge, right? When you also start thinking about older users of healthcare, right? Because it's the tsunami, they're supposed to bankrupt us. We're not supposed to like these people because they're going to cause problems. But when you start thinking about older users of healthcare, you start realizing that it becomes more complicated because older users are very heterogeneous. You have a lot of people who are healthy and independent in their 90s, in their 100s. John, I know, sends an orchid to all of his patients when they turn 100, right? You know, because again, you know, there's a triumph there, and there's some. Sorry, say?
4 women so far. No
4 women, no men. Right? You've got to do better, John. But the key is. But you know, but again, the idea is that, you know, we have people who we see who are remarkably doing well, but then we often look at our hospitals and we see that 60% of our bed days, you know, are accounted for by older adults. Many of them are accounting for chronic medical conditions, functional impairments, social frailty. That's the picture we see in our hospitals, that we almost get this skewed view as medical trainees or medical practitioners that all older people are like that. In fact, when I started medical school at Western, I believe that in Ontario, when you turn 65, you sell your home and go live in a hospital to terrorize young medical students, right? Because that's all that's there. But we actually know that only 10% of our older population are actually significant users of healthcare resources. They account for 60% of all healthcare spending related to older adults. So let me give you some numbers to help understand this. We spend $60 billion right now on healthcare in Ontario. $30 billion is spent caring for older Ontarians, but 20 of that $30 billion is spent for caring for just 200,000 older Ontarians. If you break that down, it's $100,000 per. And when I was advising the Minister of Health a number of years ago and showed her this data, she simply said to me, it would probably be cheaper, Samir, that if we just hired every one of those older people their own dedicated nurse, a geriatric nurse, and because it would be cheaper than the system that we have today. A system that was designed for 27-year-olds, not for 72-year-olds, and a system that was designed at the time when Canadians on average were only 27 years of age. That's how old Canada, that was the average age of Canadians when we actually founded Medicare. So of course you start thinking about some of your older patients, right? This was my patient, Mr. W, on his 100th birthday, okay? And you can see, but he was one of these individuals who was struggling with our healthcare system because as his arthritis, as his CHF, as the COPD started to become problematic, he was no longer able to live completely independently in his own home because whenever he had a problem, he couldn't go out to see a doctor, right? Because he was homebound. So he was just calling the ambulance and going. He went 7 hospitalizations in 2010. Right? And that was not his fault. It was because our system wasn't meeting his needs. So when we think about our dilemma here, this is my thesis. This is the work that I like to focus on, that others are as well, is that the idea that the way we think about our cities, our communities, our healthcare system is currently designed, organized, and resourced, often disadvantages older adults like Mr. W. But they don't give much credence to the concept of healthy aging. Because you remember when I talked about that 10% who accommodate 60% of all healthcare services for seniors? We need 90% only account for 30%, and actually many healthy older adults don't cost much more than younger people in our society. So there is actually a dividend if we are promoting healthy aging. And again, as our Canadians, our care needs, preferences, and values are evolving with increasing numbers of us wanting to age in place. So how do you reconcile a system that's tried to look at us in one way, but it's not necessarily meeting our needs? So of course, when you start thinking about, so how do we start thinking about this? Because this is not a Toronto issue. This is not an Ontario issue. This is actually an issue that actually unites us all as Canadians. We are all aging as a country. We're aging slightly in different rates. And then the opportunity is how do we actually then start thinking about this, not just as an Ontario issue, but actually as a national issue. And so I had the privilege of helping to advise, I still am the government's advisor for seniors here in Ontario, but I've really always been thinking that we should be doing this nationally. And a lot of us have come together, we've formed what we call the National Alliance for a Senior Strategy. We were quite active during the election. You may have seen the budget that came out yesterday. A lot of the things we have been advocating for got done. Little things that don't sound sexy, but I can tell you retirement is more secure as of tomorrow because of the things that we actually got passed in yesterday's budget. A lot of work, a lot of heavy lifting by many people, but this is why we're working on this, even though we don't have a national senior strategy. So when you think about it, the federal government, as I said, has not yet come out yet and announced its support for this, but they're well aware of this. But it recently did reinstate the Federal Minister of Seniors role, something we've been advocating for as a first step. And in the next few months, a national dementia strategy will be launched. You'll see in the budget yesterday that there's $50 million of support because our National Advisory Board on Dementia, we asked for $50 million as a priming pump because we're about to set out a national dementia strategy that you'll see in the next few months. So we're getting there. But the thing is, we're in a year of an election. And right now, we're going to go to the polls and seniors issues, likely once again, will be front and center. And why is that important? Why are politicians caring more and more about seniors? Because, who said it? Absolutely. Do you know what the voting rate among seniors is in Canada?
2 apiece.
Vote early and vote often, right? Yeah, so it's 80%, right? Now compared to some members in the room, right, that, you know, it's about 40% amongst millennials, for example. So this is a demographic where it's 5 million strong, and that means 4 million votes, guaranteed, if you can get them, right? So people are paying attention. This is why our alliance is gearing up again, yet again, for another election to see what we can get. But of course, the thing is, what are we going to get? You know, you can ask for a bunch of things, but are they going to be useful? Are they going to help us all age as we want to age? And so when we think about prior CMA surveys, we know that actually 93% of Canadians think that a pan-Canadian senior strategy is a good idea. This is one of the things I learned when I worked with the CMA. It's how you ask the question, you will get the answers you want, right? Do you think a pan-Canadian senior strategy is good? No. Of course everyone's going to say yes. But here are some of the other interesting details. 63% said the most important thing they wanted to have strengthened was home and community care. They didn't say acute care. They didn't say physician salaries. They said home and community care. So that's why in the last election, we had a bidding war between federal parties around home care funding, which is actually a provincial jurisdiction. And what happened in the health report? It became about health, home care, and mental health care. $6 billion in the end pledged over the next 10 years to the provinces to improve that. And 60%, we showed this stat around to all the parties, 60% indicated they would switch parties if their current party failed to make older Canadians a priority in the next federal election. So this is how we're using this data to kind of spur political action in a good way. And for those who are interested, Jeff Anderson, some of you may know, he's a professor in IHPME. He and I applied for a grant together, and we received the grant through the Evidence-Informed Health Initiatives branch of CIHR, and this actually helped us write this national senior strategy, all using evidence. You can go online, because the grant said it had to be publicly available on a website. You had to have all the evidence quoted and everything there, and these are actually done as government evidence. These are briefing notes. So you can go to this website, you can take a look at it, and it'll tell you what you need to do. And I'm happy to say that if you actually go through each of these pillars where we talk about independent, productive, and engaged citizens, healthy and actualized care closer to home, and support for caregivers, you will see we make direct recommendations based on the evidence. And we're really thrilled that a lot of things have happened. In the caregivers pillar, we have the new Canada Caregiver Credit, right? $6,800 a year if you identify as a caregiver. And we've taken away all the other things that made it inaccessible before. They just announced yesterday the family caregiver benefit. Now will be available if you have to take time off for your mom because she's had a hip fracture. You will actually be paid through EI to care for them, for example. Care closer to home. This is about investing in home care and thinking about how we have more home care services and other things that are there to support you. Independent, productive, and engaged citizens, this is where we talk about retirement security. So things about improving that, but also how do we get people engaged more and support them more. And finally, healthy and active lives. What do we mean there? That's our healthy aging pillar. Because you can't talk about healthy aging in isolation to everything else. And healthy aging doesn't start, at 65. Healthy aging starts at birth, right? Actually completing school actually protects your brain against dementia, for example. Actually making sure we address the social determinants of health. Helping people not live in poverty will help them actually live longer. So there's a lot of things that pharmacare is something, medication access for a 55-year-old who doesn't have a job and a workplace coverage is really important. Because when you're 65 and older, your drugs are mostly covered, but otherwise this is a problem. So these are all the things we focus on. We talk about advanced care planning. We talk about pharmacare. and not necessarily anybody's plan, but about the importance of making medication access available to all Canadians, not just older Canadians in our strategy, and where we talk about falls prevention and vaccination. So we're releasing our white paper through our National Institute on Aging. We're releasing it, I believe it's tomorrow, because we want to get budget done with first. And this is our paper on pneumonia, because we had a PHAC survey done where they asked Canadians, how, are you up to date on your vaccinations? And 88% of the response said, absolutely, I'm completely up to date. And you know what the response was? This is our PHAC survey. Only 3% were up to date. Not everybody knows that when we look at vaccination rates for pneumonia, for example, right now PHAC, Public Health Agency of Canada, sets 80% of the target. We're 82% amongst children. We're only 42% for older adults. Public Health Agency of Canada set the target for influenza at 80%. Right now for older adults, we're 62%. For our society, we're about 40%, right? So why do we have this care gap for our older adults? And partly it's because I'm sure, in our medical school right now, we're all trained about the vaccination schedule for children, but not necessarily for older adults. I certainly wasn't taught that in my medical education. And these are some of those gaps that we can address. So vaccination, falls prevention, things, all of these are components to healthy aging. And I know Sandra and Susanna are going to talk about some very specific examples as we get into things like dementia and we think about, cardiac well-being and health. So the key is, we need to enjoy our longevity dividends. And really, we have to remember that it's an undervalued concept. Again, we're living almost twice as long as we were expected to 100 years ago. Healthy aging begins at birth and requires a life course approach. It's hard to invest in solving a problem you can't see easily or immediately perceive the benefits of, right? So I vaccinate someone, big deal. Well, actually, that could have saved their life, but it's hard to actually believe in it if you don't really realize that your life was saved. And again, we have concrete actions that can help prevent falls, vaccine-preventable illnesses, and even dementia. So that's why I say that a goal of a national senior strategy is help to make a focus on this and make sure that we can make healthy aging a key focus of our work as we move forward. So thank you very much.
I think we'll take questions at the end.
Sure.
So really a wonderful setup, very positive way to begin our symposium. And we'll save your questions and we'll have a chance for the panel to ask whatever you'd like at that point. Our next speaker is Professor Sandra Black, who is the Executive Director of the Toronto Dementia Research Alliance, also a professor in the Department of Medicine, working at Sunnybrook. And the title of her talk is, Can We Someday Prevent Alzheimer's Dementia? The Dawn of Personalized Precision Care Pathways. Sandra.
I have a millennial get me set up here. The first coaching, Microsoft. Yeah, that's another thing, being elder friendly, right? For all these electronics. Okay, so I have some conflicts to mention because I'm actively engaged in various clinical trials, pharma trials, and acknowledge support. So I'm talking about dementia, and this follows along very nicely with what Samir just hinted at. We're talking about complexity and heterogeneity, and so that's already telling you something about personalization. And it's something that's really been lost in the field of dementia, pharma development, because there's also this kind of magic bullet. We just want to shoot that. I'm sorry, that's not a good analogy. I take that back. We want to try to target, something that we understand, biologically, a mechanism, but a mechanistic, be all right. Like a bug, like getting your vaccines because it'll prevent some particular bug growing. But it's been a long journey for the world of dementia therapeutics to begin to understand that this is not a simple disease. And that's partly because there's been too much emphasis. In fact, frailty and the whole body all are part of this. But I'm going to ask for some forgiveness from Samir, and I'm going to talk about the brain. Because it's kind of important. We just had a conversation, if you have a mechanical heart, like could you live without a heart? Yeah, but can you live without a brain? And it took me back to some conversations with my father about a brain transplant. Would you be that person? Or would you be the body you were transplanted into? And we decided you would be the person who has the brain, but then there's all the connections that can be complicated. So here's something that's guided me for a long time, and that's This is that the brain, like different cells in the body, you know, the brain is really part of a family of cells. In fact, the neuron, there it is. Everybody thinks it's all about neurons. But the neuron is just the kind of the gifted child, the special child, that needs to be cared for by a whole bunch of family members. And if you're lucky enough to have a good family, then you're going to do better, including education. So the astrocyte is sort of a bit like the, again, I've got to be careful about stereotypes. It's one of the parents that helps. In a kind of a nurturing way. And then the other very important parent is the microglial cells, the perivascular cells, which serve as the attacker, the microglia attack and defend when the family is under attack. You need to have, in the old days, I guess, there were, again, you need food, you need to have basically delivery of oxygen and glucose. So the arterioles are very important, and they have cells, endothelial cells, that take part in this whole story. And then smooth muscle cells, they come to control the amount of food that you're getting on a daily basis. Sometimes in our society it's too much, but in a lot of societies and around the world it's not enough. And so this is all part of this family. And axons are just the processes of the neurons, but they have their own needs and demands because myelin is very oxygen demanding. So this takes us into a much bigger view of the world, and part of my task over the last 20 or 30 years has been pointing out, based on my own observations just from my clinic, that the vascular part of this is actually quite important. It's not just sort of the supplier of food. You've got to understand, this is a holistic group, and we're just talking about the units within a vast brain, which has this kind of network. I think it's something like 40 kilometers, or maybe it's 400 kilometers, I forget which. It's such a large number that it seems crazy of networking of vessels. So how could you ignore this and think you can only pay attention to the neurons? And the truth is now, as time has gone on, because you see this clinically in the patients that have these combination of findings, Parkinson's disease and vascular disease and Alzheimer's pathology. At autopsy, this is very compelling. It shows you at autopsy individuals who are normal still have a lot of these pathologies. These represent Alzheimer's and vascular, Alzheimer's disease, other disorders of vascular, and this I think is, sorry, it's not showing up very well. It's AD, other, and vascular, okay? So there's quite a lot of pathology in those 100-year-olds. Part of what we have to understand is resilience. How do they fight it off? We've got to learn from them, we've got to study them because it has a message for us. And very often they have lived active lives, physically active and mentally active lives. Mild cognitive impairment is the stage on your way. It's called prodromal Alzheimer's disease, where you have a memory problem, but you're still functioning okay, and doesn't look all that different. And then you have patients who actually are demented, and yes, you have a bigger representation of this Alzheimer's disease, other and vascular. How much is just Alzheimer's pathology? There you go, right there. So this is like, hello, the data has been there for years, but now people are starting to say, how can we just focus on one thing? Ironically, I'm going to say that if you start early enough, maybe you can focus on something more singular. But by the time you start to get symptomatic, and as you get older, you're really battling this accumulation, just like in your coronary arteries and your kidneys. I mean, all kinds of things are happening to your body, and somehow you have to learn how to combat it. And a lot of it, what's good for your heart and good for your body is also good for the brain to some extent. But there are some slight differences. So in clinical practice, we try to summarize this a little bit with some of the axes of heterogeneity that are very common enough that it leads to different syndromes. And this is this idea that, first of all, you can have early onset or late onset. And early onset Alzheimer's pathology disease is actually very different than late onset, because memory is not the primary problem. They have language problems and visual spatial problems. And it's a horrible disease. They die within 5 to 7 years, horribly disabled. Alzheimer's disease in the very old maybe is called temporal variant, where you just have a slowly progressive memory loss, but the rest of your functions are pretty, not too bad, they're pretty good. So there's variation even with the old and the young. Then you have the axis around the presence or absence of a very important genotype. That's the apolipoprotein E4. This was discovered in the 1990s, that if you have an E4 allele, you've got about twice the risk, 3 times the risk of becoming demented by your 70s or 80s. If you have 2 of them, you're really in trouble, almost 100%. But not quite the same as those who actually have genetic mutations that lead to Alzheimer's disease in the 30s and 40s, because the important concept is that your amyloid accumulation and tau accumulation, these are the 2 important proteins that misfold in Alzheimer's disease, are incubating in the brain for like 30 or 40 years. You see it in sporadic disease in people in their 40s. So even the millennials are getting close. And then there are these other comorbidities, like Lewy body disease, white matter hypertensities. John and I go back a long way on people with Lewy body disease and cognitive impairment, and sometimes also Alzheimer's disease, because there you get hallucinations, you have fluctuations, you have postural hypotension and autonomic dysfunction. White matter disease is so prevalent that only 95% of people over 65 do not have some of it. Part of my career has been trying to understand white matter hypertensities because it's so prevalent. So, let me just see where I went over. Okay, so let's start looking at how the biomarkers are helping us now. They're transforming our understanding of these diseases because we don't have to wait to pathology to find out what's going on. Now we can see this while people are alive. It's opened up a whole new era of studying the contribution of these different pathologies. So, for example, we do spinal fluid. It's getting to a point where it's actually reliably measured. And that's good because you can measure both amyloid and tau. And this shows you that it accumulates in people as time goes on. Some are symptomatic, some are not symptomatic. It's just showing us what we saw at the end stage, and that is that you can have these proteins present while you're still within normal limits, and also that there's a big effect of the E4 status shown here. And this shows you that if you have the E4 allele, you're going to decline more towards having a dementia state than if you don't. So when I say we can see these pathologies, this is just a summary of the fact that we have now been able to see amyloid deposits in the brain in individuals for about almost 20 years, about 18 years. And now with fluoroligands, we can see it. You don't have to have a cyclotron; you can transport it. And so there are a lot of studies that are starting to be done, population studies, that show that you can have amyloid in the brain and you can be normal. But it's not a good thing if you're young. If you're 95, it may not matter so much because you've already, fought the battle. It seems to plateau after a while. And we have to understand that. But if you're 65, it means you're more likely to decline over the next 5 years. And that's led to some trial designs. Then, just a few years ago, it started to turn out that we can actually also image tau. So this is showing the map of the heat map for where tau forms, the heat map for where amyloid forms, and they're not synonymous. Tau follows functional networks, correlates more with clinical decline. Now we can see it. Tau in your brain is not a good thing because if it's present outside the hippocampus, which is sort of shown in here, and maybe in everybody by the time you're 85 or 80, because it may have to do with plasticity and just what happens in your brain when you're very, very active, and the hippocampus is the most active neuroplastic changing part of the brain. So almost everybody has it, but once it starts to move out of there, it's not good. And just a few years ago, we've learned that prion-like tau seeds and moves through the brain, as does amyloid. So it sort of creeps through the brain in functional networks. This is all new just in the last few years. This shows you that the synergy between amyloid and tau, they're kind of egging each other on. I don't have time to go into the fascinating interactions, but they affect the brain metabolism. Ultimately, they start to destroy this lovely unit how you use energy and how you function. The brain begins to, the different units of the brain begin to die, but there's a battle that goes on for years and years before that happens. Shown here, there's the amyloid distribution that we see now, the tau imaging, and also inflammation. So the microglia cells, there's an innate autoimmune fight that goes on as this battle unfolds. These are the biomarkers that have now been mapped in various people, showing that, generally speaking, amyloid comes first, they're still normal, then the brain starts to shrink a bit, tau starts to accumulate, the brain starts to shrink a bit, this is when people are still normal, and then your memory starts to go, and eventually your clinical function goes down. So this was kind of the way these dynamic biomarkers were thought to unfold, until there was a very interesting study done just a couple years ago saying, you know what the first thing is if you put all these different biomarkers together, including vascular biomarkers, the first thing you see is actually vascular dysregulation. So probably the vascular dysregulation, once it starts to go, is really when everything starts. So there are a lot of people who still don't believe that because it doesn't fit in their paradigm. But that was a bottom-up analysis of 7,000 images from the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, and it's pretty interesting. So this is just showing you how complex it is. I'm not going to go through it all the ohms, all the omics, every omic you want. We even call it connectomics, exposomics. This is our environment. Everyone wants to make it sound scientific, so they call it omic. And it is complicated. These are some of the mechanisms. I'm just going to do a whirlwind through this. Of the different ideas, mitochondrial dysfunction, very, very important. Insulin signaling goes down, diabetes of the brain, you've heard that. Calcium homeostasis, synaptic function, how the cells are chewing up these proteins, neuroinflammation. And then the spreading of the toxic proteins, that's really what we've been fascinated by, because we started to see this in models, and it was discovered that the plaques contain amyloid, and the tangles contain tau. That was in the 1980s. But pretty soon it got very exciting. And then death of the cells, of course, is ultimately what leads you to have decline in brain volume and all the rest. So let me just turn. How am I doing? Okay. So let me just turn to the pipeline, because it's been pretty discouraging, with billions of dollars lost, partly because people get on the beeline and ignore all the other evidence. And it's, sometimes it works in science. Sometimes you really do come up with a single target and you win. And maybe in cancer, certain heart disease, cholesterol is sort of in that way. It makes a big difference. If you've got a plaque, that if you get a clot in your coronary artery, that's a target. If you can get rid of it, the person may do very well. Just like in the brain, if you've got a plaque, actually in your MCA, your middle cerebral artery, and you get in and pull it out, 50% reduction in mortality and 50% reduction in disability, just in the last few years. Mind you, it's going to age all our stroke neurologists, so they're all going to be in trouble because they don't get enough sleep, and they're way too busy, and we don't have enough of them, and we don't have a system that's working yet, so that's another interesting thing. So basically, we need to have biomarkers, we need new endpoints, we have to change our infrastructure with new designs, and we have to share across pharma and academia in a way that everybody benefits from the knowledge. Okay, so these are some of the desideratas, and this is showing you this is from a few years ago, all the things that didn't work out, and all the different attempts to do things, and just try to give you the sense of how expensive it's been and how unrewarding it's been up till now. So then I want to just finish with a little bit of what may seem contradictory in view of what I just said, which is so complex, what can you do? Well, one of the things you can do is start early enough that you can maybe prevent it. Because then maybe a monotherapy will help. So for example, if amyloid is building up and you can detect it in your brain, or tau is building up in your 40s, and you knew how to sort of stop that while you try to figure out all the other complexities, then maybe you could delay things. Maybe you could delay things. But even that has turned out to be so complicated. There's genes that can overproduce it, the amyloid precursor protein, it produces these monomers, they become oligomers, fibrils, diffuse plaques, and then they plaque, and they just come up your brain, right? And the thing is, you may be able to stop at different stages. And probably if you're going to do monomers, you better get early. Because if you're doing anti-monomer, and you're already at the fibrillar stage, it may not be so great. So these are the clues. The clues here is that amyloid has many stages of development. It's actually much more complicated, I have to say, for tau, because there's different tau species that we're only learning about with something called cryomicroscopy, which gets you down to nanometer level of seeing that these fibrils. You can see the fibrils within tau. There's fuzzy tau, there's tau, and there are different forms of tau, and there are different taus in different neurodegenerative conditions. And who would have thought it, right? Because we're as good as our tools, and our tools are getting better and better, and then we're discovering more and more complexity. But maybe there will be clues. So these are different interventions that you might be able to think about, which I'm not going to go into because time is running out. I've got too much to say, as always. But the timing might be really important. So if you could get at the plaques maybe 15 years ahead of the deposition, and you can do this in the pre-senilin cases because they're getting sick at 30, while they're still, maybe they've got 15 years before they dement, and their children are still young. That's already happening. But this may be a way to move forward. So you've all heard that none of the antibodies work, and that's not true. A lot of the first pass at this, they didn't know exactly how to design the molecules. They were mouse-human hybrids. They didn't know how to use them. So I'm just going to summarize by saying this is the only paper ever got in Nature, that ever made Nature, that was a clinical trial, because it was a phase 2A. And it's from a, what's the matter with you? I need another one. It was a humanized antibody based on, they found a resilience gene in a Arctic, a Norwegian or I think Icelandic population, and they figured out maybe how to make the antibody. And what it showed was in the disease stage that they were able to remove plaque, shown here. This is baseline, and then this is the placebo, and at 1 year you can see that red stuff is bad stuff, is disappearing. And they've done this before where you can get rid of the plaque, but it doesn't do any good. Whereas in this study, the reason it made it to Nature, they actually showed beneficial effect on clinical outcomes. This is the clinical, this is a clinical dementia rating, some of boxes where you do an interview with the patient and the family. So it's got a little bit of cognitive in it, but a lot of kind of personal, like what's different about what you're doing in relation to what you should be doing in your life, okay? And then the other is the MMC, which is kind of useless, but we still use it as a kind of way of, sorting out severity. So it's out of 30, you all want to be 30 in this room, and you don't want to be 1. So it does have some logic that if we could go early, we might be able to stop, even though we haven't got the whole thing sorted out. I know that the timekeeper is getting nervous. The base inhibitors are another thing where we can actually inhibit the production of amyloid, but amyloid's there for a reason. It's probably an acute phase reactant. It's doing something important. It's probably helping to prune and shape the brain too, as well as the tau. So you got to do it just right. You can't sort of over control your diabetes so you get hyperglycemic. You don't want to be hyperglycemic. Some happy middle. And this is what I want to tell you, and then I'll try to finish quickly. We are already into immunotherapy for primary prevention. And I'll tell you about one trial that we've been doing for a few years, and it's aiming at the solanezumab. It aims at a monomeric form of it, of the amyloid. And it was open to people who were 65 to 85, who may have some reason to be concerned, family history, subjective complaints, maybe they knew their E4 status, and they volunteered to have a PET scan. If it was positive, then they were offered a clinical trial, randomized to solanezumab or to placebo. Monthly infusions. This is in its 4th year. And what they figured out partway through is they were underdosing, and so they upped the dose, but they still have not seen futility, and they have not seen any safety signals that would prevent them from continuing. So this is so Lilly lost big on this antibody in the Z stage. Probably dropped. I don't know, half a billion or a billion, something like that. But they stayed with this because they think this may still be meaningful, because these are people who are very healthy when they start. And the idea is to prevent them from declining compared to their baseline. There's also a study for people who are homozygote for E4, where they're going to take base inhibitor. And then in the autosomal dominant cases, where they have a presenilin mutation, they're already being randomized to a couple of other agents that are looking promising. So anti-tau now is coming along, and combination therapies might be in the future. There's this idea, though, that if we can prevent delay onset by 5 years, we could reduce the prevalence by 50%. But Samir may be interested. These calculations were made in the 1990s when life expectancy was much lower, and we weren't doing all those great cardiac and cancer preventing and treating therapies. So this is what everybody cites, but I'm not sure it's true anymore because people aren't dying. This is assuming death, and they're not dying as much. So we usually put this up to kind of drive this idea of prevention, but it may not be accurate anymore. And here's what's really important. This is where Samir and I come together, because it's about age is a risk factor, but vascular risk factors like hypertension, cholesterol, diabetes, cardiac disease, stroke, smoking, dietary habits, all these are driving the dementia process because it's vascular, it's neuronal, it's all these things together. You need sleep to get rid of amyloid. Deep sleep is when your brain is draining out the bad stuff. Physical inactivity, bad. Hearing loss is another interesting factor that's come up recently. So whatever we do, it has to be combined with lifestyle. It has to be combined with the things that help you be able to age at home gracefully. And I'm not going to go through some of all of these because I'm really running out of time. We can have a discussion later. It's just that we need a lot of things. We need to get better. We need trial-ready normal people. We need trial-ready people who have problems. And we need these large-scale prevention studies which are underway. And one of them actually showed great success, combining exercise, diet, cognitive training in at-risk men who had some mild cognitive impairment. So I'm just going to flip to acknowledgement and trainees to make this point in light of Lory's victory in the field of transplant, saying, and in Canada we have something called the Canadian Consortium for Neurodegeneration Aging, and Howard Chirko, who's the scientific director, was moved here from McGill. But this is really a wonderful enterprise. There's like 400 investigators, probably 30 or 40 institutions across the country. There are different themes, different platforms, cross-cutting themes like training, capacity building, knowledge transfer, ethics, women in dementia, the sex and gender theme. And somehow or other, it's all come together. We've had our first 5 years, and it's just gone in. I hope some of that money for dementia might help to mitigate the disappointment all the people were about to hear about how their money was not what they wanted. So it was about a $32 million with some partners investment, and the second round, which we haven't heard from yet, is $46 million, but we need $100 million. And so I think it is an example of how in Canada we do work together, maybe because we have to. We do try to be geographically balanced, but I think it is something we can offer. Our single payer system and our willingness to collaborate, I think, is a huge asset in the global scene. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Another inspiring talk, and again, a theme of hope and lots of things that we can do. Our third talk is by Dr. Susanna Mack, who is at Sinai, and I understand is starting as the Division Director for Cardiology September 1st. So congratulations on that accomplishment. Her talk is Heart Function in Older Men and Women, Implications for the Ability to Exercise.
Great.
Sorry, I'm trying to adjust this. As you can see, I'm a little height challenged. Samir is right. This is actually a relatively intimidating audience. And I know Dr. Black just talked about the mini mental status exam and that we all want to score 30. Right now I feel like I'm about a 27.
So anxiety, yeah, it affects your cognitive.
No, I'm very pleased to be here today. I think it's a very important component of healthy aging is the ability to maintain our ability to exercise. So certainly without that, what's the point of growing older if we can't enjoy the things we want to enjoy? And I want to talk about it a little bit in terms of some of my research, in terms of heart function in older men and women, and how that may affect our ability to exercise as we age. So a central tagline of my laboratory is that the ability to exert, exercise, or be active is fundamental to human health and well-being. And the guidelines for physical activity in Canada state that for adults over the age of 65, they should accumulate about 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous aerobic activity in bouts of 10 minutes or more. And these guidelines were published by the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology, and they align with guidelines internationally. And adults who manage to achieve this standard tend to live longer, have less disease, and a better quality of life. But you won't be surprised to learn that less than 20% of adults over the age of 65 actually meet this minimum guideline. And the reasons for that are multiple. They range from physical immobility to cognitive to social, and then in Canada, environmental. But presumably, the inability to exercise will prevent us from perhaps accessing some of the benefits of exercise to our health. So a very important human experience that affects our ability to exercise is that of breathlessness. And if you actually poll carefully, and I'm sure Samir hears this in a lot of his older patients, up to 30% of our older population, and that's actually a little more common in women than in men, experience breathlessness such that it limits their instrumental activities of daily living. And these are activities fundamental to our social well-being. These are things like moving in our community, going to visit neighbors, going to places of worship, cleaning our residence, and preparing meals. And these are the basic features that maintain a dignified life. So an important question from my perspective as a cardiovascular physiologist is to investigate some of those cardiovascular reasons that might be underlying the breathlessness that some older people experience. So some of the questions we ask are, what are the age-related changes of the function of the heart pump in men and women? And how do these changes affect the ability to exercise? And how might these changes actually influence the development of some diseases? So a physiology lesson. The heart is a simple mechanical pump, and its primary function is to deliver blood and oxygen and glucose to the brain, Dr. Black, and of course to our working organs and muscles. And basically, it's a pulsatile pump, which simply means that it fills during diastole, right? And that it generates force or pressure so that it ejects during systole. And it ejects in a beat or a pulse that we refer to as a stroke volume, right? And if you multiply that by the number of times our heart beats per minute, you can calculate the cardiac output, which is the simple total amount of blood ejected by the heart per minute. So if you're Homer Simpson and you're lying on the couch in the resting state, cardiac output is about 5 liters per minute. And that delivers us about 200 mils of oxygen per minute. So about a cup of oxygen per minute if you were to measure it that way. And when we exercise, oxygen demand can increase in the range of 10-fold or more than that. And as such, cardiac output would need to increase, right, to meet that demand. And we can actually measure cardiovascular fitness capacity using a special exercise test where we also measure oxygen consumption at the same time. And if we adjust that for body weight, we have a measure of cardiovascular fitness capacity, which I'm going to refer to as peak VO2. So not surprisingly, peak VO2 declines with age. And one of the reasons it declines is our peak heart rate falls as we grow older by about 30%, and it falls equally in men and women. VO2 peak itself falls by actually almost 50%. And at every age group, the peak VO2 achieved is significantly lower in women, as is the peak work rate achieved. So why is that? So if heart rate is about the same, there may be other mechanisms that explain differences in the ability to increase stroke volume as we age. So one of the simple reasons that women cannot generate the same sort of cardiac output as men is simply the difference in size. So not only do we look different, but the size of the female heart is actually a little bit smaller than that of the male heart, even when you adjust for body size. And this is just data from the Dallas Heart Project that shows the MRI data that confirms that stroke volume in women is a little bit smaller than it is in men. So women are more reliant on heart rate to achieve adequate cardiac output. In addition to that, women actually also have some limitations in terms of being able to remodel the heart. And this is seen best in athletic remodeling. So as we all know, if we're a trained athlete, we say the heart gets bigger. It's something called athlete's heart. It turns out that that is something that's mostly observed. I need a millennial too.
Just a reminder.
It's about time to get some appreciation. We need you. And we want you to.
Well, thank God he's not being able to fix it.
Projector.
Oh, is it the projector?
Okay, thank you very much. And it turns out that that ability to enlarge the heart is actually attenuated in women compared to men who train. So for an equal amount of training, a female athlete cannot see the same heart enlargement as a male athlete can. So there are these baseline differences between the sexes, and there's also interactions, right, between aging and sex. So it turns out that women and men are different at the beginning, and they also age somewhat differently in terms of their cardiovascular physiology. And this is data from something called the Olmsted County Project, and this is like a Framingham study for heart function. So these investigators studied thousands of healthy, older individuals and did detailed measurements of heart function. And without going into too much detail, what they demonstrated, oh, I did it again. Okay, sorry.
Just click advance again.
Okay. So Dr. Black, I'm doing worse than you are, right?
Multiple choice.
So certainly, as we age, what they noted is that both the blood vessels, as well as the heart pumps themselves, tend to stiffen as we age. And not only do they stiffen, that tendency to stiffen is actually more prevalent or more precipitous in women than it is in men. And I'll talk about how stiffening affects our circulation in a couple of minutes. It turns out the function of the heart to relax and to fill with blood during diastole is also dependent on both age and sex. So that ability to relax and fill the heart with blood is actually most active in young women, then declines in both women and men as we age, and actually crosses over. So that ability to relax the heart is actually most limited in older women. So how does that affect the circulation? Well, this is actually circulation as it was explained by William Grossman, who was author of quite a famous textbook. And he imagined the circulation as a train with each boxcar carrying about 1 liter of blood, which then carries about 200 mils of oxygen. And the left ventricle pumps that oxygenated blood through the high-pressure systemic vasculature, delivering oxygen to our vasculature and our brain. It returns to the right side of the heart, deoxygenated, and then the right side of the heart needs to pump this deoxygenated blood through the lung blood vessels. And it's important to note that the lung blood vessels are at much lower pressure than the rest of our circulation. And if you have a stiff vasculature, and if you have a stiff pump, it requires more pressure to actually drive the entire system, so that not just the systemic vasculature, but the pulmonary blood vessels themselves are also exposed to high pressure on an ongoing basis as the circulation stiffens. So the way that I measure this in my laboratory is we do a procedure known as right heart catheterization, and that's actually how we measure pressure in the circulation, in the heart, and in the lungs. And what we do is we introduce a catheter or tube into the venous system. We thread this catheter through the right-sided chambers of the heart into the lung blood vessels, and in that way we can measure pulmonary artery or lung blood vessel pressure. And we can also measure something called the pulmonary artery wedge pressure, which is a reflection of the pressure that the heart fills at. And just suffice it to say, higher pressures certainly tend to cause breathlessness. And this is actually a couple of still shots from my laboratory, which is where we do some of these experiments. Dr. Thomas actually participated in one of these experiments where I threaded a catheter through his arm and up through his heart, where I can make continued measurements of the pulmonary artery blood pressure, as well as the pressure, that wedge pressure, that pressure of the filling of the heart. We can place that tube in safely, even in normal volunteers. And then you can see in this particular case, this is actually a trained athlete going through one of our studies. And we can measure these pressures continually while this person exercises. And at the same time, we can take pictures or ultrasound pictures of the heart. So that's sort of the experimental methodology that I use. So what did my laboratory do? We asked a simple question: does age and or sex affect the cardiac pressure responses to exercise? And the simple answer is yes. This is actually one of the first studies that we published a few years ago. And these were healthy older adults from the community. They were your neighbors. And they actually submitted themselves to our experiments. And what we saw is in older adults, as soon as one starts to exercise, pressures in the heart and lungs actually increase quite abruptly. That lasts for about 2 minutes or so. If we continue to exercise, those pressures will start to decline. When I challenge you with a little bit more work rate, those pressures actually increase again quite abruptly for another minute prior to declining again. And this is not a pattern seen in young people. This is a pattern seen in older individuals, where the system seems to pressurize after the onset of exercise. And this was work by a colleague of mine, Finn Gustafsson in Denmark, who showed something similar. He actually measured the peak lung and wedge pressures in healthy older adults, compared them to middle-aged and younger adults, and you can see that those pressures rise more precipitously at every level of exercise achieved. And in a follow-up analysis, what we also demonstrated is that for the same amount of work rate and the same effort, right, at all levels of exercise, that wedge pressure response, that pressurization in the heart, is higher in women than it is in older men. Okay, so what does that mean? What are the implications for disease? What are the implications for our human experience? We know that there are likely sex differences in cardiovascular physiology that predispose men and women to experiencing cardiovascular disease differently. So this is a study done this is a population-based study in which they looked at sex differences in lifetime risk and first manifestation of disease. As we all know, men tend to experience coronary heart disease earlier, right? Heart failure takes off much later. And heart failure and stroke actually are increased much more precipitously in the female population than it does in the male population. Right? And it's this difference in the way we experience disease that we think may have its roots in the baseline sex differences in physiology. So how is that relevant to the population currently? Well, one of the diseases of my interest is heart failure, particularly with preserved ejection fraction. And as Samir said, this is thought of as a tsunami. This is actually a graphic from the Heart and Stroke Society in which they talk about heart failure as an epidemic. It is on the rise. Over 500,000 Canadians live with heart failure. Heart failure is a huge burden of costs. I'm sure if Samir actually broke down the costs he discussed, heart failure is responsible for about $3 billion in direct costs. And the cardinal feature of heart failure is breathlessness. This is work from a colleague of mine, Barry Borlaug, at the Mayo Clinic. And he demonstrated that a cardinal physiologic or diagnostic feature of HFpEF can be demonstrated using the same methodology I just showed you. So this is the methodology that I use in normal individuals to study baseline sex differences. And he demonstrated that patients with HFpEF have this very precipitous rise in their wedge pressures in response to exercise. And this is also, these pressures are much higher than the pressures that I showed you with respect to normal men and women. And what Dr. Borlaug speculated is this may be an accelerated process of cardiac chamber stiffening. And that does make some sense to me, that it's possibly this particular physiology in its accelerated format that predisposes us to develop heart failure with preserved ejection fraction as we get older. And that there's a transition in the physiology such that when we're young, we can exercise without much pressurization of the system. As we grow older, that slope steepens. It seems to steepen more precipitously in women, suggesting they may have more limited reserve So that if another factor comes along, Dr. Black, such as diabetes, hypertension, obesity, sedentary lifestyle, eating fat, many things, right, accelerate that tendency to stiffen, women may have a more limited reserve and cross over to the disease threshold much more readily. So we've taken the methodology for normal physiology experiments and converted it into a clinical diagnostic, and that's known as the breath program. So breathlessness revealed using exercise to assess the hemodynamic response. And what we think we can do with this particular preparation is that we can make more detailed measurements of the phenotype of breathlessness. And we actually, without really much advertisement, we get quite a few referrals. There are a lot of people, when you look through when you actually ask people, there are a lot of people who experience breathlessness who are often told it's just aging. This is just normal. Well, in the past, we really didn't have a great way of phenotyping that or measuring what was just growing older versus what was abnormal. And this is currently what we're trying to develop. So we're trying to understand whether this particular type of phenotyping can actually tell us something about patients' breathlessness. And in the long run, we hope that it may identify a population. As Dr. Black said, this does not start at 65. This process of stiffening of the heart chamber probably starts at birth, right? And so what our hope is that we can actually phenotype this problem with more granularity. So in summary, I've shown you that the reason that age and sex do influence exercise from a physiologic perspective. There are several effects of aging, including limited heart rate responses and the stiffening of the vasculature and the ventricles themselves. There is an effect of sex in that there are greater limitations to begin with in women compared to men. The limitations are evident at lower efforts, and there's less tolerance in women, perhaps, in the context of ventricular stiffening. And that may be relevant to the onset of this epidemic we call HFpEF currently, which clearly shows a predilection for women, and is clearly accelerated by comorbid conditions such as hypertension, diabetes, and obesity. And it's amazing how all talks end up with the same conclusions. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to thank you for listening. I've just listed some of the people who helped me do some of the research that I do. And thank you very much. And break time.
Why don't the other panelists join us? We don't have time for a few questions. But I can't, our tradition, of course, is to give you a gift, which is a very attractive umbrella. It's very bright.
Thank you.
Who says it? Nobody will steal it.
It'll be hard for us to forget.
No, unfortunately not.
So we have time for a few questions, either for the panel in general or for one of the speakers. So the floor is open. Go ahead.
Sandra, you alluded to the fact that we often see people together, and the individuals often present to me because of orthostatic hypotension. And I was taught that the neurological manifestations often take 7 years. The first phenomenon occurs as a change in the gut, and then the change in the autonomic control of the heart circulation, and eventually you start seeing neurological signs. I'd like to couple that with some of the recent work suggesting that cerebral angiography with amyloid is maybe a prion disease. I'm wondering whether the source of the problem arises in the gut, and whether prions are being taken up by an altered microbiome and then infiltrate the vagus and then travel up to the central nervous system. Is this primarily a gut-initiated problem with prions?
Well, I wouldn't conflate prion with gut. So the gut microbiome is becoming of great interest in the dementias. And in fact, we're doing, amongst the other things we're doing in the CCNA, is we're doing fecal swabs across all the cohorts, which include Parkinson's, you're talking about Lewy body disease, Parkinson's, Lewy body disease, Alzheimer's disease, frontal dementia, and vascular conditions. And particularly in Parkinson's disease, which seems to have a very important environmental component, both pesticides or history of exposure to chemicals, but also maybe the gut microbiome may be different in people with Parkinson's. And it's thought that there may be some kind of transmission going on as almost like an infection or like some reaction to the infection that gets transmitted to the autonomic ganglia and vagal nerve up to the brainstem. Because there's some thought that in the brainstem you get the sort of first signs of the death of cells that relate to the forming of alpha-synucleins. The misfolded protein in Parkinson's conditions is alpha-synuclein. But they're prion-like. It's not like the actual prion disorders, mad cow disease and so on, which occurs in mammals and different animals. There it is much more easily translated by infection, from one individual to another. Not so easy with these ones, but we're still not sure about that. So they're prion-like because they misfold and they kind of create the substrate for continual misfolding. And I think that will be important in understanding Parkinson's disease. It's less clear in the other conditions. I don't want to dominate the call, the question period. But amyloid itself, I think, some people think amyloid is partly an acute phase reaction against infection in the brain. If you have a stroke, you have a head injury, you form amyloid. You also can form tau. They're part of the cleanup and defense league, as well as the shaping league. So there's a lot of this we still don't understand, but the gut microbiome is really going to be interesting.
Thank you. So just the gut microbiome, of course, is my field in depression. It's very interesting now. Just as an aside, another very common brain disease, and really interesting work with fecal transplants for refractory depression here at UHN.
Is that right?
Very, very promising. Other questions? Go ahead, Jennifer.
So thank you for a wonderful panel. I've learned a lot, and I guess one of the things I'm trying to do right now is connect some of the dots across the panel. So I'd be really interested to hear, for example, from Samir, when you're thinking about a dementia strategy, often it's based on what we currently know, what current practice is, and yet thinking especially about what Sandra has said, maybe shifting thinking away from thinking that dementias are primarily neurological as opposed to vascular. That's a change in thinking as much as it may be a change in practice. And then also what I took from Sandra too was moving backwards in time, so early intervention in really significant ways. So you're putting forward to government a strategy. What can you take away from what you've heard today that really ensures that we're really translating the scientific knowledge actively and intentionally within that strategy?
Sure, and I can start and Sandra can follow. So I'm not doing this, luckily, right? So it's the government that's actually been forced through legislation to come up with a dementia strategy, because Canada's the last of the G8 countries to actually form a dementia strategy. The Prime Ministers all agreed in 2013 to do it. And so it was actually a bill that was passed by a backbench MP to say we need to get on board. So of course, as we were speaking over lunch, right, this is now the legislation, the act now states that our federal minister has to report back on the progress of our official national dementia strategy in June, except we don't even have a strategy yet to actually report back on. So this is the process I'm involved in. So I'm part of a board that actually includes Howard Churchow,
Bill Rushman.
Thank you. Our chair is one of the co-chairs. So we're all working together, and these are the exact questions we're asking, because partly it's how do you make a strategy based on what you know now versus what could happen in the future. And Sandra did mention, because it's come up at our board meetings, like we need to do more research, but what do we research on? And and how much money do we need? And who does that research? And that's a huge debate where we don't even have the answer on that one. But what we've tried to concentrate right now, and I think all I can speak to is what's been announced in the budget, is things that we can concretely do. The fact that we have many people living in the country with dementia. Many people don't know that they have dementia. Many people are misdiagnosed or not diagnosed. Many people don't know what to do if a family member has dementia, how to recognize support. There's a lot of stigma. There's just, so things about awareness, stigma, understanding, but also the fact that someone else, I think at lunchtime, said, well, what about just rehab and therapy and care? How do we do that? So this is where we're starting to think about what is the broad framework we can have that can then encompass the work that Sandra was talking about and give it a platform. So people say $50 million over 5 years is really, well, we put $101 million over 3 years in Ontario for our dementia strategy. So this is relatively little, but we were keen to put something in the budget now to say the government's putting money forward, but it sets a platform in motion to say, now that we have a strategy, we can always up-fund more things once we know the answers, well, frankly, once we come up with a strategy.
Can I just quickly say, I mean, I think the magic bullet is not the answer, and in fact, the magic bullets, if it's anti-amyloid, it can be quite expensive. Although there may be new ways to deliver, like focused ultrasound and so forth. But I think the responsibility of everybody is to do all the things that we're talking about in terms of physical activity, guaranteeing education, food security, infection control, vaccines, all of these things that are part of just healthy living. I think people worry about the kids who are, sitting on the computers all day long and getting more obese, etc., because they're supposed to be better than we are, right? So exercise, getting enough sleep, that's something new that people aren't so aware of. Again, kids, they're getting wakened up by their notifications in the middle of the night, not sleeping. So sleeping, diet, fat, salt, sugar, bad, trying to, so those are all responsibilities we all have as citizens for our own personalized approach, right? And then I think you bring up this huge issue of what if you can't do 150 minutes a week of aerobic exercise, because it's not just the heart, but people who have stroke, or people who have arthritis, or other, I point to my knee because I got so I think we need to personalize it so people can get to do what they should do as best they can. Maybe it strengthens them, maybe there's other ways.
We have to stick with the program too, though, right? Because I think some of the outcomes are not going to be realized for another 30 or 40 years. So, for example, where Canada now has a trans fat strategy, it's trying to develop a sodium strategy. These are things that won't actually see benefit, right, for a number of years. So I showed you the slope of stiffening of the vasculature. What you really want to do is actually attenuate that slope. But that will take, that's an outcome that will only be seen over about a 20 or 30 year horizon to me. But well worth doing.
We're going to take two more quick questions, one in the back, and then go ahead.
Just to follow up on Dr. Samir, what you said about what someone would know what to do. So if you know a family member that might have dementia or Alzheimer's, and the family doctor is not really very helpful, what would one do to access the care? Does one go to a geriatrician? Does one go to someone like Dr. Black? How do we get a CSF test or a tau imaging? What does one do if you know of someone that does have, or think of someone that may have dementia?
Yeah.
What's the first step?
Well, I think it goes back to it's back to that first step is many people aren't even aware. Like I have lots of families that say, "Oh, I just thought mom was being funny for 10 years," and it's actually no, this was actually dementia, right? And there were things that we could have done earlier on to help out. So part of it is just raising general public awareness in that. The next point you brought up is what happens. You said, what happens if we have a family doctor who doesn't know what this is or what to do? Because the stats are startling that they say about 2/3 of people with dementia actually, are not being diagnosed. People living in the community, and then 50% of those who are diagnosed aren't even disclosed their own diagnosis, right? So part of it comes down to our medical education. So one of the big things I've been a big proponent of is I never got taught geriatrics as a medical student. I got taught pediatrics. But how do we fundamentally make sure that every doctor, every family doctor, every doctor graduating knows these core things about how to promote a life course healthy aging approach? And then we can make sure that we then say, really people like Sandra and I, we work together on some patients, as well, of course Susanna too. And part of it is, you shouldn't really have to come to me for a lot of the care that I'd say Sandra and I provide, or Susanna, because if we make sure that we empower our frontline providers with that knowledge and support, then we can really be that specialized resource in the end. But if you need help, call any of us.
So I just want to point out that our medical school curriculum does have a big focus on aging now, so I'd like you to take a look at it. I had the same experience of not learning very much about it during my medical school, but Samir and your colleagues have helped us a lot with that, so we do have a lot of cases. So two quick questions. One to Kishna.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for the informational panel so far. My question really stems from the foundation behind the medical system. So doctors are usually doctors to prescribe medicines. And today we really talked about one connection, underlying theme about aging in general, which is exercise. So adherence to exercise is very hard. Adherence to exercise is probably harder than adherence to a drug. It's much easier to take a pill and get on with your life, your shift or your work. So how, as doctors or as clinical professionals or people that are in the field, what kind of internal perspective do you have, or do you see the future being in prescribing physical exercise and not being a physiotherapist? And how do you get people that you're very concerned about and that you know exercise will make the biggest impact to adhere to that kind of program?
It's an excellent question. I think there's a short answer. So what do doctors do? I mean, doctors probably see pathology at the time where it's never too late, but certainly the disease course is already established. So what we prescribe, and one of the questions about what we do with the senior strategy, a lot of these things are about pragmatic and immediate sort of addressing of needs. So exercise is certainly a therapy, and we actually offer therapy to people who have established cardiovascular disease. It's interesting that there is funding, for example, for cardiac rehabilitation, which is actually an underused therapy. I think that we are trying. There are several organizations. There's a network across the country for cardiac rehabilitation. I think probably this extends to things like stroke rehabilitation as well.
Because they're using the Toronto, they're using rehab sites, cardiac rehab for stroke.
Absolutely. But I do think, as I said, it does start probably much earlier and not perhaps with physicians. It starts at a policy level, which is why what Samir does is so important, right? Because he speaks to the things that we can do as a society, and it's about what we value. That's what politics is in a sense, right? It's what we value, right?
Yeah.
And so these kinds of strategies that start with policymakers really you do have to actually advocate for these things very heavily. So certainly Samir's doing his part.
It starts in school. It starts in,
yeah.
I want to keep us on time. Just there was one very patient person there, and then if you have other questions.
The City of Toronto Recreation funds all kinds of fitness programs for over 65. They call cardio. Believe me, there's everything in that. But if you were managing it, knowing what you know, and as I tell, almost all of them are women that attend. I haven't been to one yet, but I have more than one man in the group. What would you, as a manager of those programs, recommend to them in terms of the way they design a cardio exercise program for the older age?
Yeah, I think that any activity is a good activity, right? So I think that cardiovascular activity, resistance training, all of those things are good. I think, so I don't manage one of those programs, but I think one of the biggest issues is really how we keep people adhering to those programs. And perhaps, delivery of those programs is limited, right? Especially in the City of Toronto. Like, who's going to drive, right? Or take the TTC, take 45 minutes to get to the gym, and so on. What's interesting is there are actually quite a few studies that look at the development of parks and recreation. So you actually develop a network, a pathway system in our residential neighborhoods, right? People are trying to study the outcome of that. So if you have a nature or a fitness path or some sort of and here in this country, one of the issues is environmental. But if you set up those fitness paths, right, there is some literature suggesting that the outcomes of your population actually improve. So it's again more broad spread kind of initiatives than that I think.
But the stroke volume issue.
Can I just make a quick comment?
Yes,
I think
two quick questions.
What I wanted to talk about is the stroke volume issue as they age, in terms of telling instructors how to manage better the women component of aging and exercise.
So I'm going to invite people to ask our panelists at the break. I'm just going to get a quick comment from Sandra and Samir, and then we're going to say thank you to the panelists. And
I'm just going to say, if you can figure out ways to reward people and make them know that it's helping them. I think wearable monitors, and I think also ways of showing that there's progress, and you got to keep it up. That might be helpful for certain individuals. We've motivated by that.
And just the quick thing to add in is one of the things we've tried to do here is that the City of Toronto is all our parks are now being redesigned for those age-friendly standards. And one of the quick things we did was we put $10 million as part of our provincial senior strategy to create 2,000 free exercise and falls prevention classes. They're available where people actually gather, mosques, or in the local, just the local public space. And in our first year, we had 107,000 older adults participate. And it's about making it accessible, making it easy to do the right thing.
And taking care of their arthritis.
So let's thank all of our panelists for a really stimulating. We'll reconnect in 8 minutes at 3 o'clock. Thank you again. That's great. Thank you.
Kind of just talk a little bit. So, please be on the faculty of let's talk Ontario is unique.
Okay, so good afternoon, and so again, you know me as Samir Sinha. I have the pleasure of moderating our afternoon panel, which is about living forever, or living forever, question mark. And so we're going to follow the same format as we just did earlier, and we have 3 great speakers. I'll just quickly introduce them now, and then they will they'll come up for their chats for about 20 minutes each, and then we will have, sorry?
May I suggest the format originally is instructed, it was 5 to 7 minutes.
5 to 7 minutes.
So that there's engagement with the audience.
This is why I'm not in charge, I'm just the pretty one. Okay. Thank you. So what he said. So the first person up is going to be Dr. Fiona. I'll just introduce them as they each have their 5 minutes. So Dr. Fiona Menzies, who is the Chief of Geriatric Medicine at St. Joseph's Health Center, and she's going to speak to us about managing frailty. Fiona.
It's my pleasure to be here today. So I thought when I heard the title of the panel, what we're really talking about is frailty. So this is my perfect slide, the balance of what really dictates how frail we might be. And if you think of someone who unfortunately has had a stroke, they have this illness, they may have a disability associated with this, some weakness, they're certainly unfortunately going to be more dependent on others. And then there's a burden to caregivers. The scale suddenly shifts to them becoming more frail versus someone who is in good health, has an excellent relationship with their family physician, has lots of resources available to them. They maybe have a community center very close where they exercise daily, and they have a very supportive friend-family network. Suddenly this person becomes slanted on the other side of the scale, and you can imagine them not being frail at all. So keeping this Canadian, Ken Rockwood has developed the clinical frailty scale. And I really like this one because it has the little pictures of each people and what that kind of means for you. So some days I'm well, but I'd like to say some days I'm very fit and exercising daily. But really what we as a geriatrician see, we're seeing people in the vulnerable to mildly frail to unfortunately even very severely frail category. And we do know with research that we can't move people beyond one step back. So if you're moderately frail, the most I can hope to achieve as a geriatrician is to get you back to mildly frail. So clearly we have an opportunity here. We need to target the vulnerable population and see how we can shift them to managing well or the mildly frail to vulnerable. This is how they will age well. And why is this so important? Frailty predicts survival. So again, if we want to have a long and healthy life, we need to be not frail. And I think this really hits home. No one wants to be in a long-term care facility. I think it's actually the complete opposite. People want at all costs to avoid that. So again, frailty predicts a long-term care placement. We need to avoid this. How do we do this? I hope this is a happy, I actually hate running. I do it just to get my, hopefully more than 10 minutes of aerobic exercise every day. But it's physical exercise, even walking. It's a healthy diet, although it's very controversial what that healthy diet should actually involve. But moderation, it certainly would you be doing a good job. And it's not smoking, maybe quitting smoking. It's not drinking excessive alcohol. And when I Googled social isolation, I got this interesting picture. But I think it does represent, we need to be engaged in our communities. We need to be talking with people, going to this kind of venue, hopefully on a fairly frequent basis. And the future, to prevent frailty, we have to work on preventative medicine, which I think our excellent speakers have sort of highlighted on already today. We want you not to develop heart failure. And how do we do that? It's when you're in your 20s or your teens. And the future is also looking at our genetics. How can we predict people that will unfortunately go on to be frail, and how do we try to target those people with very intensive interventions at early age? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Our next speaker is Dr. Jennifer Gibson. Let's see if I can get this done. Probably two things at once. What is that? It's a pleasure to introduce Jennifer, who is the director of the Joint Center for Bioethics here at U of T, and Jennifer is going to be speaking to us on the ethics and aging in a digital age.
So, thanks so much for the opportunity to meet with you today. It was a real honor to be invited, so thank you. So, as I made a minor tweak to the title, and I put healthy back into it. And so this is really what I'm hoping in my short reflections here is just an opportunity to open up some conversation about the intersection between these three areas: ethics, healthy aging, and what is emerging as what we could call as a burgeoning digital age. And some of this work is reflection of some of the work that we're currently doing at the Joint Center for Bioethics, where we've launched a program of research focusing on ethics and artificial intelligence and health. But of course, there is a great deal there's synergy here between thinking about AI and thinking about digital care, and particularly related to two themes. One is in relation to the future of caring. What does caring look like as we look forward 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And also, as we see the emergence of some of these tools into the health space, what does this mean for equity and the digital divide that might emerge? So in my remarks, I'd like to touch on three things. One is the burgeoning field of digital health. The second is to share a little bit about what we already know about Canadians' views about healthy aging at home, but the uses of technology in that particular context, and then some of the ethical and practical implications that this might have for all of us in the future. So thinking about digital health, I mean, some of you in the room may be wearing a Fitbit or other type of wearable device. Some of you may be wearing a device that enables your biometrics to be monitored on a regular basis to keep you healthy and well. But those aren't the only types of digital interventions that we're starting to see emerge. We see organizations responsible for building homes, so the home buyers and organizations talking about how can we create safer homes that would be able to collect biometric information about each of us to prevent falls, to ensure if one falls, that there's someone who's able to there to pick us up if we happen to be on our own. And so this graphic, I think, really nicely captures the range of different ways in which digital technologies are now being used, whether it's in telemedicine, whether it's in consumer wearables, whether it's in the use of your smartphone, in order to be able to communicate with your provider in any number of these different ways. And so recently there have been a few surveys that have been done to try to get a better sense of what do Canadians think about this. So one of the surveys that was done most recently is some reporting done by Stats Canada that found that Canadians were reporting that they are active users of the internet, for example. By active use, meaning using internet at least a couple of times a month. And they're also using their digital devices on a regular basis as well. And this is across age demographics. And what's sort of interesting about the demographics is that two of the main growth areas are certainly those who are 65 to 74, and additionally, over the last 3 years, those who are 75 plus, by a difference of 15% and 16% increase just in a 3-year period of time. We also know that Canadians are generally positive, feel positively about the potential for these technologies to be useful or to inform health in a number of different ways. And that might be in the form of making care more accessible. If you live in a remote area of the country, don't have easy access to a primary care physician, a virtual hospital or healthcare visit could be really valuable for you. It might also enable seniors to stay at home much longer because they know they've got a connection to those who may be able to help with their need. At the same time, while Canadians are, perhaps according to these surveys, embracing more technology and AI in the health system and supporting investments in those areas, they're also saying they don't want to see these investments come at the expense of fewer doctors, fewer care providers, nurses and others. And they also want to make sure that they would be willing to use a number of these tools if recommended by a clinician or supported by a group of clinicians. And so it really underlines again what is emerging through some of the findings, that Canadians are open to these technologies, but not if it comes at the cost of a loss of compassion and a loss of caring in the process. So that gives you a bit of a sense of the sort of curiosities Canadians may have at this time of using these technologies, but also what may ultimately matter for us in the next 5-10 years as we see some of these move into the health space. So what I thought I might do is just think of and provide a bit of a case study of my two moms. My mom, who is my birth mom, and my mother-in-law. And I use these two as examples because these are two healthy aging people. They have a lot in common. They're both in their later 70s, both survivors of cancer. Both of them are physically active and cognitively fit. They're both comfortable financially. So if you read just through that list, they tick off all the boxes in terms of the social determinants of health. So it's no wonder that they are as healthy as they currently are. At the same time, though, they're of two completely digital kinds. One has been using a computer for decades. The other one's never touched a computer, which is surprising, right? One uses her iPhone, her iPad, her laptop on a regular basis, texts regularly, emails regularly, Googles regularly. One of them and the other one does have a mobile phone, but only uses it for calling and only in an emergency. The others, one of them watches Netflix and TV interchangeably, can move between technologies. The other one is only familiar with their TV. One of them has a graduate degree and a BSCN in nursing, was a health professional, and the other one has a high school education. And I flag these two, so where my two moms sit right now, they are examples of healthy aging, but with the introduction of digital technologies, might we start to see a digital divide between these two, which might lead to outcomes that were not what we're hoping for. So this raises, I think, a few questions that we may wish to ponder together during the discussion period. One is, when we're thinking about the introduction of new technologies, despite the enthusiasm that we may be hearing from many, who stands to benefit from the promise of these technologies? Mom number one, my mom actually, is clearly in a state of digital readiness. She can put an app on her phone and start to use it if she chose to do so. Whereas my mother-in-law, no. She's got a steeper hill to climb if she's going to be using these. But even so, we should be asking ourselves which benefits actually matter and which ought to matter. So while on the one hand, the use of some of these digital tools may mean fewer hospital visits or healthcare visits, prompter access to clinical advice, more timely monitoring of health states, they're primarily health benefits understood very narrowly. And if it means that, if on the other hand, it means that there's increased social isolation or increased loss of mobility, I'm thinking about my two moms very particularly, who get out of the house to go to a hospital visit, add on errands and a visit with a friend, but it kind of goes in that order. Healthcare visit prompts getting out of the house. And the more that they become digitally engaged and at home, we might see some of these losses. So it's something I worry about in their particular cases. What unintended consequences might result? Now, a lot of these digital technologies really focus on high contact, but there's low touch involved. And we've already heard that Canadians are worrying about that. So many of my colleagues who work in primary care will say how much it's important for them to see the person in front of them. It's the things that you can't pick up on a screen, such as the pallor of the skin, or the smell of the patient's breath, or the distractedness, or the hesitation before answering a question. All of those things we're not going to be able to capture in the same way through these tools. And so while on the one hand, we might actually optimize some independence, we might, on the other hand, through these tools, we also might be losing sight of some of those things that are more meaningful. We might be emphasizing what's efficient over what's caring, what's measurable over what is ultimately meaningful. And then finally, at what cost and to whom? And I mean, one of the reasons why I used my two moms was precisely that cost is not an issue for them. But for many Canadians, it will be an issue for them. So while we may save some time, we may save some effort, we may save some dollars as well as an individual level, we also need to be thinking about, for example, my mom number 2 has got a steep hill to climb. She doesn't have the devices at the ready for her to be using these. And so one question we might ask ourselves is, as we start to focus on independence in these particular ways, of focusing on self-care, patient empowerment and engagement in these particular ways, can we achieve that without inadvertently just simply continuing to isolate, to reinforce, or to exacerbate some of the silos that currently exist, some of the fragmentation that already exists, and some of the disengagement that we see already. So I'll leave these as three questions that we might be able to explore during the discussion period, and really welcome your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So last but not least, I'd like to introduce Dr. Susan Juglow, who is our interim chair in the Department of Physical Therapy here at U of T, and she'll be speaking to us about rehabilitation interventions for successful aging.
Thank you, Samir. I think some of what I'm going to be talking about briefly actually we've touched on already throughout the day in terms of, for example, exercise. So what I thought I'd do is actually provide first just a couple of definitions so that we're all on the same page, and end with also a little bit of a challenge or some questions. So when we think about rehab, and I thought it was important because again in rehab, a lot of times people, when you say rehab, people think drug rehab, not physical rehab. So the World Health Organization defines rehab as a set of measures that, and measures here is used very broadly. It could be different interventions that assist individuals who experience or are likely to experience disability. And so what's really important with respect to this definition is, again, thinking about achieving optimal function and how one does that. And so one of the questions I'm going to throw out to you is, again, how do we support healthy aging in people living with chronic conditions or injuries? And we started to touch a little bit on that. So to think about who should be providing these services or that kind of support. Because not everybody is going to be healthy. The second concept I'd like you to think about, again, when you think of the first one and you think of individuals with chronic conditions, you're thinking of, again, about maybe some assistance from healthcare providers, for example, rehabilitation professionals. But what is the responsibility of the individual with a chronic condition? And here we think about the issue of self-management. We really haven't brought up self-management that much in the discussion today. So again, this is a common definition that's used in the literature. And what's important here to think about is self-management is a behavioral intervention. And what we're trying to do is really increase patients' or individual self-care skills and involvement in the control, which is very important, of their care. And the way that's done is commonly through problem solving, goal setting, action planning. And these are all important when you think about exercise program. How, if one thinks about how you set up your exercise program and you taking responsibility for it, it might be through these three actions: the problem solving, the goal setting, action planning. So some potential rehab interventions that myself and colleagues are working on. One, at the top of the list, exercise programs. And so some of the questions that we're grappling with is community-based, group, individual, should it be supervised? Who should it be led by? What type of healthcare professional? And what type of population should we be targeting? In terms of self-management programs, there's been a lot of work that's been done on what's called the CDSMP program, which is the chronic disease self-management program that was designed at Stanford University. Some of the work and common to these programs is that they're peer-led, there's a health coaching, patient education, and what we've seen in the literature is that they are associated with better health outcomes, lower hospitalization rates, and reduced healthcare expenditure. So should we be promoting these types of programs more? And some of my own work is in developing a self-management program for persons living with osteoporosis and also persons aging with a spinal cord injury. And so again, with these programs, do we do them in a group? Are they online? Are they, who should lead these programs? Only peers? Should it be a combination? And finally, Jennifer already touched on this issue. Another aspect of rehab interventions is technological interventions. So a common example are some of these fall detection systems that are being designed. And again, you have now all these monitors and things in your home. So who's collecting that data? Who's looking at that data? How is it being interpreted? So again, all the ethical issues around those particular interventions. So since I'm a health services researcher, one of the things I think about is when I'm designing interventions, fine, we can determine the efficacy, how does it work or does it not, but what's really important is actually then the implementation of these interventions. And so we think about it usually, so I'm throwing it out to you at 3 levels. What would be some barriers at the individual level, the provider level, and the health system level? Thank you.
Fantastic. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get some help here to move these things away so people can see the panel. And then we will open up to questions from the audience. But just before we go to questions from the audience, I don't know if anybody wants to react to each other's presentations. I think Fiona helped conceptualize the struggle, for example, of frailty and how we think about aging as kind of both assets and deficits, if you will, this concept of how we try and balance that and try to help resilience and focus on that. I think Jennifer really helped kind of frame this growing digital divide, and it was really interesting because from a policy perspective, we at the Ontario government level, we were having a meeting the other day, for example, we were talking about, we have a minister responsible for digital strategy now, right? And so one of these things is, like I always talk about how many people don't know how to navigate senior services. And people say, well, with our digital strategy, let's just put everything online. But one thing I remember was, when I was in rural Ontario, I had some older adults come up to me and said, don't listen to that person who says put it up online. Like, put it up online for those who own a computer and those who are literate. But what about those of us who we just want a phone, right? So the 2 moms I thought was really exemplary about that. And then Susan really helped to speak to us about, when we started thinking about kind of this idea of exercise and programs, some really key questions about, can people do it themselves? If people are actually delivering it, who needs to be delivering it, right? Because there's professional hierarchies and, well, I should be delivering it because I'm a doctor. Well, is that really correct? And then how do we actually engage people in self-management in that? So I don't know if from those different themes, anybody has questions of each other, and then we'll bring up to the audience as well. Or we can just go right there. Let's start off with your question then.
Well, thank you all for touching on these issues. It was fascinating set of panels to speak speakers, and I think you are all zeroing in on one really critical issue about looking at all of this. In the end, it often comes down to an equity issue. Urban, rural, north, south, funding, lack of funding. Even those of us here at the University of Toronto have a wonderful healthcare plan. Anyone who's engaged in our physiotherapies will know that those funds run out before you even turn around. And then it's out of pocket for thousands more if you want to continue that physiotherapy, that training, those home visits. For the elderly as well, just an additional aspect on the digital side, even if they aren't digitally savvy, we are in a country where it's been shown that the rates that we pay for cell phone access for modems is exceptionally high on a worldwide scale and bizarrely varies from city to city to city to city. So in the end, a lot of this, even if it is available in the best possible world, comes down to the plain old story of social equity and the ability to pay. How does that work? You've all touched on it. It strikes me that it's actually pumping its head up, perhaps a little implicitly again and again. And maybe in the end, that's one of the key issues that we need to address here, as we do so many other aspects of social justice.
Samir and I were talking about this the other day. We need people who are frail to have quarterbacks. And it's amazing what people can do as like a life hack. So I was at a home visit the other day, an extremely intelligent woman who has mobility issues, and she is not remotely digitally linked in, but she really likes Grocery Gateway, and she's just calls them every week, and she has one person she talks to who knows her well, and I think they actually have a really good friendship now because she talks to them every week, so it provides a little bit of friendship. So I think, if you think of that case example, we have to look at each individual case and see how do we bring in these resources, because they're out there, but it's really hard to tap into them, especially if you're in Northern Ontario or somewhere where you're not as connected as in Toronto.
Susan?
Just to follow up on that, I think we have to think about how it is we fund healthcare and what falls under that basket of services, like you're saying. Where does then prevention fall in? Because again, we're always responding to some sort of acute event rather than thinking about prevention and around sort of the social determinants of health. How do we support those sorts of activities so that we could actually improve in those areas? Right now, again, the way things are funded, you have to be. It's a sickness sort of paradigm.
Yeah, a bit of shame,
paradigm.
right? That seems to be when suddenly we start throwing resources at people, but it certainly should be more on screen, right? I don't know how we achieve that. As a geriatrician, we do see people a little bit further in their pathway, right?
Jennifer, did you have any thoughts?
Just simply nothing novel to add to this, except one interesting finding that speaks to the issue of cost again. From one of the surveys, it was CMA Ipsos survey, 80% of people would be willing to try the digital technology if it was publicly funded. And so I think almost in the inverse, it was signaling that people are aware of the cost-related demands that some of these things would offer. And then you can start to stratify that across some of the other inequities that we may find. So I think there's maybe an opportunity, just in terms of even just at the university, about how we begin to think about some of these things, that actually brings, this is where we need multiple disciplines working around this and multiple providers working on this, and as you were saying, multiple levels of decision-making around this to tackle this, because this is as much a public health challenge as it is a clinical challenge, as a social challenge, and even ourselves, I think, as within the university, that's the opportunity to start breaking down some of those barriers. Like I would love to sit down working with a sociologist more often than I have to, or a historian, for example, in the work we do.
We have tons of questions. I was worried. Okay, so I'm going to go from my left to my right. So
thematically building on that, it's been my observation that in many cases some of the problem is in the navigation. It's not only the availability of services, but even where those services are available, it's helping people to get to those services. And you don't always need to be a health provider or a health professional in order to do that, but you need to be knowledgeable about the particular area. Don't think you need to be really digitally conversant to be able to encourage someone to get a computer and to sit down with them, or have somebody who is knowledgeable sit down with them. Conversely, encourage someone to go for a walk with you or whatever. And it's been my observation that the navigation is not funded in any particular way, because it seemed to be a voluntary activity, or it's incumbent on the individual to take care of it, or the family to take care of it themselves. So I think we need to build mechanisms that support the community to offer navigation capacity. And that's often a soft service, as a social service, as opposed to a health service. So there are tools, there are telephone tools, and I'm on the board of Ontario 211 that is the soft side of the 911 healthcare emergency line. And it just seems to me that we need to foster the development of those navigation aids at a community level. And that's where I think our deficit is, and I'm not sure how to go about doing that in a way that actually produces results consistently.
Perfect. Any comments, or we'll go to the next question? Okay. I'm going this way. We've got, we have a hand right here. Please go.
I think I'd also like to build on this idea of episodic or crisis-related care and encourage us to think about the different professionals that may be involved across the spectrum of that acute to subacute to longer term to the settings that we have people try to do things in. How do you maintain your health if you're in a rural community versus if you're in a city community? And that may also fit with that navigation part of it is, you know, we have somebody go into cardiac rehab, they have great care for 6 months, and then
it's over.
It's over. Yeah, because certain types of exercise programming are funded and others aren't funded. I don't know if anybody wants to respond or react.
I don't know if it's...
No, we're all agreeing.
We all agree, okay.
I hardly endorse that.
No, that's fine, that's fine. Please go ahead.
Yeah, well then I'll play devil's advocate here. In terms of setting up exercise programs, like if you look at the advent of Instagram, for example, every third person I know from high school is a personal trainer now. Right? Everybody just wants to get in the gym and like start teaching other people how to do things, and that's really, really dangerous because there are some people that are not medically trained, and I mean the training doesn't have to be extensive. You don't have to go through medical school to learn how to move your body, but you do need to have fundamental understanding of anatomy and also of the health of your spine, the biological age of your spine. So like with issues like that, do you think that it would be even not affordable, but would it ever enter like OHIP's radar to even to entertain some kind of program where it's not led by doctors per se, but it is led by some medical professional who does understand the aging process?
I'll
Yeah, please.
answer some of that. So actually, one of my colleagues is working on a program just like that, where physical therapists are actually training fitness or YMCA instructors with respect to task-based exercise program. And so that's been a really interesting initiative where they've partnered with the community. The challenge that they're going to have is going to be then the ongoing sustainability and funding of that program. So their idea is, let's show that it works first, and then we'll go and talk to some of the policymakers and see if funding would be available. But in this case, it's always a one-off in terms of who you go to for the funding. So I don't know with your national seniors
which doesn't exist.
Which doesn't exist yet. So this might be something, in terms of how these programs are funded to keep people healthy. I think, is an important thing that we have to keep coming back to.
And just one thing to link these two ideas together is again, when we look to other countries and other examples. So it was, so my PhD supervisor in England, he actually had an injury, and then he was actually bedbound for a while, and then he figured out how to rehabilitate, and now he's a historian. but he was the official historian for the National Health Service. So he went onto the NHS website, and he actually found that there was a publicly facing section where he could actually look at videos to how to retrain himself physically, right? They were actually done by physiotherapists. They were through the NICE guidelines and all those good things. And I asked my colleagues at Sinai and UHN, I'm like, do you know about these videos? And they're like, they're very good. We actually sometimes share them with our Canadian patients. But again, he actually developed his own home exercise program and was able to rehabilitate himself, back to his original health, which was amazing. But it was telling me again that promise of technology. But again, I'm glad that he didn't find one of my Instagram videos on how to work in a gym. But he actually could go to a look. They don't exist. Don't look. But the opportunity where he found something that he could trust as an older person that was actually done and was actually being funded as part of a national strategy. In that way that could actually help. So it's interesting but back to the two moms question, if you don't have a computer and don't go on, are we actually doing a disservice? How do we reach the others?
Well, I think there's a couple of, and I'm sorry, I'm not close enough to the microphone. Okay, I hope you can hear me. I think one of the things that may be partly lurking in here, but we haven't really touched on yet, is there are multiple conversations about health that happen, but they don't happen at the same time. So we've got conversations about health within healthcare that identifies it with hospitals, acute care, and physicians and drugs, right? Those types of interventions. But when we're talking about healthy aging, we're talking about everything else. And so, if we're going to shift the paradigm thinking about what aging is healthy, aging looks like this, maybe eventually it looks like frailty, but even in a frail state, one can still have health in some way and have a meaningful life. We're going to need to change not only the way in which we structure funding, but the way we think. And so I think it's going to be a bit more of a challenge, but that's where I think where this example, that your question, your example, those are the sorts of stories that I think would be worth hearing more about, because it helps to change that conversation ever so slightly. So the digital side, I've got two healthy moms for the most part, but I can see risk coming at both of them of different kinds, but one in particular I'm particularly worried about, precisely because it's everything else but the healthcare system that's at issue.
I'm just wondering whether it's known about the impact of commercial promotions on television and newsprint on health decisions by elderly people, and to what extent they influence their decision versus what we talk about, which is science-based medicine and health promotion. So I have a feeling that an awful lot of decisions made by people depend on what they glean from television and what they glean at cocktail parties and what they make up on their own because a friend has taken a certain kind of pill. So my question is, to what extent are the decisions based on the social or government-determined or regulated approaches versus commercial interests?
So I think some of it is, I think, learned very early in early adulthood. So I have, and I'm sure you can think of the same, I have a cohort of patients who tell me, you just don't exercise, that's not a thing. Even though in our generation now, no, of course this would equal healthy aging. So I think maybe what we do need is just an action plan for older people. Sort of highlighting the benefits for that. Because I think they are open to that kind of idea, but it has to be a cultural change.
Can I just respond to it?
Please, yes, no.
I also worry a little bit about the sort of commercial side of things. So if any of you who've been watching addictively CNN ever since the last election know that you are being exposed to multiple types of drug advertising every single episode that you might watch. And we don't have that in Canada. So, I mean, that's a policy decision that has been made to, what's that? And
we see it.
We watch CNN. Right. But nevertheless, I mean, that's just a policy instrument. But there's this interesting thing. I teach, one of my courses is ethics, genetics and reproduction. So we're really looking critically at technology. And one of those that we've been looking at is 23andMe. So we've had this really interesting conversation about, it's almost like science communication that has gone awry. I mean, 23andMe is a data company. It's not a genetic testing company, it's a data company. And so it is now just sort of partnered with GlaxoSmithKline. Well, you can see you've got a drug company partnering with a data company to create pharmacogenetic options for us. Yeah, so I think that there's some interesting dynamics in there that happens sort of insidiously, and a lot of these wearable devices or a lot of these interventions like 23andMe start off as recreational for entertainment, and then they start to move closer and closer towards being health tools. And I think it's sort of an insidious process that partly is facilitated by the way in which we regulate such devices. And the FDA is a key driver of Canadian technology advancement. I know it's a US, but that's beyond.
Okay, we're going to go to this side of the room now. So I'm going to go to our lady over here.
Probably one of the best things I learned when I was in medical school from a public health physician was how to change behavior. And he had a model in which he said, education is a component of changing behavior, but it doesn't change behavior, but it must be included. Rules and regulations help, but they have to be enforced. We're lucky with smoking, you and I would enforce somebody if they tried to smoke up here. But with most things, no, you have to hire people to do it. It is only by changing the environment in which people are in that you can actually change the behavior, because they will behave according to what the environment demands. So until we can create an environment in which exercising is pleasurable and easy, you can have it.
Yep, it's an upward battle. And I think it depends on where you are in Ontario and Canada.
That's why you have an environment there.
Yeah.
Those are all environmental issues.
You think of someone up north, ice 9 months of the year, you're not being outside.
You can't walk on the busy streets in the rural areas. I have a friend who lives in rural outside of London. He goes to a mall every day to do his walking. It's exceptional.
But there you go, right? There are tons of mall walkers out there. Hopefully the majority of my patients, because we advocate for that. I think we do see these, I think, as challenges, but they are opportunities to try and
But you have to be able to get into a car in a rural area to be able to do that.
But one of the other things is, how do we think beyond this, right? So back to our therapy colleagues, right? If we say, okay, so the funny thing is, I think Susanna showed the new Canadian exercise guidelines for older adults. The funny thing is, like, my colleague Jane Dorton, who was part of that process, was like, actually they're the exact same for younger adults, right? It's 150 minutes of all ages, so it's interesting. So I'm like, oh, what's different? She's like, nothing. We just, by classifying it, like now older adults have their own guidelines, but they're really the same as everybody. Everybody should be getting at least a minimum of 10 minutes a day, and then at least 150. But the new study just came out today. It's saying a minimum of 10 minutes even starts helping you. But then the question becomes is, how do we enable that? So when a person says, I can't get out to the mall, I don't have a mall in my community, or I can't do this, like, are there things I can do in my own house, right? Yeah, and the answer is yes, but then how do we make that accessible, right? And so, we have tele-rehab, we have other interesting models that have been developing. This is about thinking about, stretching and thinking about different opportunities and getting those messages there, so using those mediums for benefit. So we've got 3 hands over here, so we're going to start with you first. Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to share with you that accessibility we were providing in malls, a little story, I guess. I actually met a bunch of ladies that I tennis with. My tennis team, they're all in their 70s and 80s. They can outplay me physically, technically.
Strategically.
Yeah. 80-year-olds.
You're really that bad.
So I'm learning accessibility that they don't go to malls, they don't go, but when I talk to them, they've played for the last 30 years. That's they've had this venue. And so the difference with that being at home versus, I think they found it not only enjoyable, but it's social.
100%, yes.
So to that thing at home, you miss that part. So they connect with each other, and many of them have been playing together for a long time, and they play amongst everybody across Ontario in the team. And so I just want to share that. I mean, if there were more...
But they're tiny now.
Well, they're...
Very tiny.
Yeah, so I mean, if there were more programs and more promotion of that kind of thing that people can actually gather together socially.
But so there's all these general fitness programs and a lot of seniors, residents and stuff, but they're crap. They don't raise their heart rate one little bit.
They're sitting
And they,
chairs.
and the structures is mystery, because I checked them out, what were they doing? And they said, well, you know, we're really just planning a social occasion.
Yeah. But there's benefit to that too. Okay, we've got 3 questions here. So we have Dr. Black at the front, we have 2 hands at the back. So and we've got a 4th one here. So let's do the 2 questions at the back first. Then we're going to do 2 questions at the front. But your question
You have to
first.
monitor your own health care by law and predict that.
Say that again.
You have to monitor your own health care. Anyone over 18 responsible for the law. Distributors will be responsible adult unless otherwise, with certain exceptions. End of story. And that makes everything far more accessible, equitable, cost-effective, efficient, timely, personalized, individualized. Technology is here now. That's coming, because if it doesn't come, the government will be incredibly corrupt and thrown out. That's going to come, and around the world eventually. But certainly in the developed world, that's going to come. So you're thinking like national strategies, and people don't learn, and they have all these lazy, blah blah blah. They don't care. You want it for the good of the common good, for the majority of society, for those who do monitor their health care on a regular basis, right? Those who consistently choose not to monitor, they will have the consequences of, they're not denied health care. They get what is really, in effect, and always has been the case, medical rationing. Only this will be more formalized and more equitable and reasonable, etc. There's no, to me, there's no argument. And I can understand why people won't talk about this openly and reasonably. That's answers so many of the questions and issues you're talking about. Don't talk about words on a paper or legislative reform, or you're going to throw a few more $1 million, which is nothing in healthcare. It's nothing. Okay? So that's the real issue. And that's, I think, is why I do make a prediction. Even though I'm an historian, by the way, I'm not a political economist or healthcare or sociologist. I'm a historian of medicine. I absolutely predict that. And I don't think when words have fallen silent because we go, oh, it's invasion of privacy, oh, it's, it'll be cumbersome at first, and very difficult, medical demographics, the majority of people are imaginable, blah, blah, all the reasons you can throw why not to do it are answerable and addressable, specifically, timely, right now by the technology. So I don't, I'm just throwing this out because this is what you need to be talking about, everyone.
Okay, thanks. We're going to, again, we have 3 more questions to get through, so let's take your question 2. Try and keep it short, please. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
I will try. On different, I think, related-ish note. So we talked a lot about healthcare and how exercise programs can build healthcare, but something that I thought is missing is that there's a small fraction of people when they're elderly who are able to exercise. But that small fraction, I'm sure, is the same small fraction of people that have been exercising their entire life. So when it comes to healthy aging and to go building habits, so how important is habit formation in children and kids and education and making gym class not just about playing basketball, but instead about things that can be maintained for life. When we have this societal value that you go to work and you sit down all day, and no one in a workplace is taught to value movement and how that can improve productivity and happiness and these things. So how do you see very creative ways through the entire life process, not just in old age and making old age programs of exercise accessible, but changing the societal values? Which can change. We have a lot of, for example, marathoners who suddenly take this up at the age of 80 or even older. I think I think your fitness changes with time, and sometimes it goes backwards, right? You don't perhaps become a marathoner. I do think it's worthwhile looking at. They are outliers. I agree. But I don't know if I necessarily agree that the group that are physically active in their 20s would still be the group physically active in their 80s. I think things do change.
There is a substantial body of literature that proves that you can take it up at different ages.
Yeah. Right.
Roy Shepard back in the 1970s did a lot of that kind of work. There's more current work. Those marathoners are outliers, but a lot of people, when they retire, find they have this time.
But again, because it's when we retire. And so there's all this benefit that could have happened before retirement, because we're not valuing it a lot more in the first place.
But it's never too late.
It's never too
late. But could it be easier if we chose to value it over the lifespan? Could
So
it be more benefit?
then there's intergenerational programs, so you have older adults exercising.
There'll be no trouble.
No, so it says general discussion, but is this?
I'd like to,
lots of options.
Is that okay? Okay.
So may I make
Yes,
executive intervention?
Because it says general discussion, so like, we are having.
No, the point is the discussion is robust.
Yes.
So I think you should just move into the general discussion.
Yes.
And just continue.
Yes.
For another 10 minutes. I think it'll answer most of the questions, otherwise be frustrated. So let's do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I think I just wanted to comment with that, because you made one comment that only a very small minority are actually involved in exercise. It's actually, you know, I'd say the majority of older adults are actually active in some way. The question is, we still have a significant group, for example, that, you know, are either sedentary, I think as Susanna was saying, like not doing anything at all, or not getting enough exercise as well. So it's not that only 2% of the elderly are actually exercising, and they were always the ones who were exercising. The question I think you're also commenting is on how do we promote this as a regular thing right from the beginning? How do we promote that as a lifestyle habit that continues and doesn't just start when you have more time or you have that? So you know, and that's something we're trying to make sure that people even see the value in doing that versus spending 10 more minutes watching TV. How do you stay more mobile? So, okay, Sandra's been patient at the front, and we have a few other questions here. Then we'll come back to this side here, Sandra.
So there are 20 points, but I'll just do this quickly. So first of all, to Jennifer's comments, I think that we have to be a lot smarter to jump over that hill, because your mother-in-law shouldn't have to do all the things she has to do to participate. We should be able to just talk to our devices. Talking to the inventor of smartphones, in his 80s, he was interviewed, and they asked him about a bunch of things, including he had the idea of just carrying it around as opposed to putting it in cars, which was a competition. I forget which is Motorola and who was who.
Right.
And then they said, so how do you think we're doing? And he said, I think it's terrible. It's not smart at all. You have to have a PhD to know how to use the devices. This is crazy. It's gone in completely the wrong direction. KISS. Keep it simple. Allow elderly, young, everybody use it, and use probably voice. If you don't have voice, then you might have to have adaptations. So I think it's time that the senior citizens of the world who find this not intuitive, because they weren't 3 years old when it was introduced, that they should have a simple way to do all these things.
And to your point, Sandra, I think one of the reasons why, one of the hypotheses about why we're seeing an increase in the use of these devices across the life course is precisely because they're more usable. They're friendlier.
And people use parts of it.
And people use the parts that matter.
So it comes back to voice recognition.
Yeah.
You said, well, you can't pick up a pause when you're on the phone. In fact, there are voice recognition softwares that are trying to identify people with Alzheimer's disease based on pauses and how they speak. It might even be a way you could diagnose. So it brings up the whole issue also of wearable monitors. So for example, if you want to do remote, uncoached, which is probably not a good idea, exercise, you may want to make sure the person's not at risk. So there could be some need to ask a few questions, and then maybe they would have to do a couple of days of wearing a monitor that will tell if they're hypertensive, if they have a heart arrhythmia, or something else that might be a problem. And then maybe they could be allowed in a regular exercise program. It could be coached in some way that would give them incentive and would carry on. So these are things that are available. So back to the wearable monitors, the last gentleman. So yes, in China right now, one of my former students spent some time in a couple of factories there and noticed that everybody's wearing Fitbits. And the way it's starting to happen is that you're encouraged to put in your steps. And if you do, you get a little extra cash. If you're not, what are the consequences? And how are you going to enforce that? So that's why in an authoritarian regime, you can control people a lot more than perhaps we are comfortable with. So Big Brother is not only watching, but Big Brother is punishing. So I think we do have to be very, very careful about this. But there's no doubt that wearable monitors can allow people to self-monitor, self-manage. You can know if they're complying. But if it's done in the context of support and coaching and encouraging people, sometimes they have the right to say no. And then yes, they're going to cost more. Do we not give them health care? I mean, I think those are all issues. And finally, I just want to make a point about adaptive exercise, because I think that's a huge unmet need. You know, if you have arthritis, if you maybe even have the heart failure issue, or if you have a stroke and you can't run around, or you can't, maybe you can sit on a bicycle, a reclining bike, there has to be much more attention to people who would like to exercise, but they can't. They've got special needs. Do they not have the right to try to achieve some sort of cardiac fitness? And arthritis, I think Julian, as she went out, said, what about people with arthritis? So that needs a lot more attention too. And that's a huge, you know, are you condemned because you can't run around like you're supposed to or walk around a mall? Not to be able to be fitter. So those are my comments.
We've got a question over here.
Yeah.
We have two questions over here. Go ahead.
Okay, so when there's no question that the Asian population is increasing, everyone's living longer. When we were organizing the symposium, we thought, how could we make it more catchy? And one of the ideas that we came up with was, let's add in a question of how to live forever. As the panel's name is How to Live Forever. And with the advances in biotechnology, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, biochemistry, is it possible do you see it possible that we're going to live even longer lives and possibly forever? And is that something that's good, bad? What are the ethical implications of that? Potentially.
1 minute.
It's open to everyone.
Okay, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is, do we want to, right? I mean, and I'm not entirely sure that's the case. My great-grandmother's 103. She said she's cognitively, their body's falling apart. So it's great because she can engage with the world this way. But she said, I wake up in the morning and I ask myself, what's my purpose? So I think there's, we do, when we look at some of these technologies, and maybe some folks do want to live virtually in some way forever. Maybe that's the way to do it. You live virtually, like your digital self continues on. I'm not sure. But I do think these are questions that kind of really get more at what is meaningful, like what matters to us as being human or members of a community that are more philosophical. But that's where, again, we need those types of reflections, as well as the technology folks in the room, as well as the clinicians in the room, to be exploring them. So I'll leave it there.
Question over here.
Yeah. So I think it was brought up earlier on about the idea that all these different technologies could be more receptive by the public if it was publicly funded. And it does make a lot of sense, like in the sense of like all these like big tech companies who somehow just creep into the biomedical realm, you know, like make devices and then don't have the social responsibility to kind of figure out some issues. Like, you know, for example, the Apple Watch, they started doing heart rate monitoring and making these diagnoses and such.
Right. Yeah.
But do you think, like, I feel like those companies definitely have like the manpower, like they have the power to be able to actually create all these different type of, you know, like really cutting edge technology to help in medical care. But is there a way to kind of create a synergy with policymakers and these kind of private companies so that they can do it properly?
I'd like to say I would like to see that happen, quite honestly. And in fact, I'm reflecting back on something that the director of Believe, Sasha Bashia, said the other day, is that, you know, unless we move into that space, commercial interests will. I mean, why not? I mean, it's an opportunity. And I think one of the things about some of these technologies is that it's hard to distinguish what is a health-related tool because it can also be used for multiple things. So it's kind of like, it's almost like a form of life that's starting to emerge. Like we're so interconnected through device. I keep touching my handheld just because it's reassuring. Just to give an example. But I really think that it's sort of, I think there are those opportunities. I think where some of the gaps are, we, at least in the health field, at least in Canada, we don't have a lot of experience developing governance models, for example, to work constructively with industry in certain sorts of ways. So pharma is one area where there's been a ton of policy work that's done. That's great. But then even starting at the grassroots level, we've got a bunch of really creative people developing tools. Like they're developing startups, they've got great ideas, they're translating scientific knowledge they're gaining from our universities into something that are applicable, but where do they go from there? So I think that we're in a really weird space right now where we're trying to get some of that figured out. I'm optimistic. I'm much more optimistic than some of my other colleagues are actually, that we can get this sorted. But I do think it's a complex environment right now.
There was a hand here that didn't get to ask a question, so I want to make sure, did you?
Well, it's not a question, it's an observation.
That's included.
That physical education, or gym as we used to call it, is now no longer, what I've learned from my grandchildren, is no longer a daily requirement. And I was actually horrified to hear that. Their activities, physical activities at the schools, I'm talking about public schools, I don't know, but private schools, have reduced the number of physical activities, and just something that was so part of our growing up, phys ed and gym, has been eliminated from the curriculum. And that starts very, well, Fiona might be able to answer that because she has little ones.
My son is in JK and the librarian gives twice a week physical education, which is terrible.
Yeah.
So how, I mean, that's.
But again, it comes back to the idea that, again, if we think about, if our goal is to promote health across the life course, and then we say, again, back to, some of the comments here about, okay, we're a rights-based society. Okay, so that's our direction right now. We're rights-based. So, and we choose our governments to basically, we elect governments to deliver what we want, for example. But if they're not, and frankly, I think someone said what was the most important part, like the role of a politician in the city. So, I remember whatever they said, I disagree with, because I'm like, I know that the most important job of a politician, I've learned right from day one, is to get reelected, right? So frankly, if we say, as citizens, we want you to help us stay as healthy as possible. If we go back to this position of healthy aging is our societal goal, for example, that's when we start saying, well, the evidence says that we need to be exercising. How are we doing this, right? Now, if we tell people you can't enter the school until you've done your 10 minutes, that's one way of doing it. Or do we say, let's make this a part of the curriculum? What are we teaching? How do we make sure our technologies, back to Jennifer's comments, are enabled, right? And how do we make sure the right messaging is getting out there to help encourage or nudge positive choices? But even little things like, how we design our public spaces and our public realms. These sorts of things, like our new design for the City of Toronto parks has bathrooms in it. Why is that important? My big reason? Incontinence. If people are incontinent, they don't want to go out in public. They don't go out in public, they don't get any steps, right? And so how do we, and it's a little thing that people forget about, but that's not the only reason, but it's a huge barrier for someone wanting to participate. So all these sorts of things can enable healthy aging, but how do we think of it that way? So again, if we don't ask for this, governments will respond based on what we tell them we want, right? I mean, they can easily mandate anything any day, but they're only going to do it if they think it'll help them get reelected and get some votes.
But the explanation why it was even reduced and partially, eliminated from what I would call just a healthy experience. And so it was, to my knowledge, in the old days, it was a daily activity. So there must have been some expectation or not expectation, but explanation as to why it was reduced. And So if politicians, if they want my vote.
Yeah, don't look at me. I'm not a politician. I'm just okay. So I know I'm gonna get the right here, but we had a question here, and then maybe a hot pursuit in front. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, sounds great. So my question is, I think we've been hitting on some very important points about where the responsibility not lying on medical professionals per se, but people that would be doing the training or people that would be orchestrating education. So within the curriculum. But if I can put you on the spot now and say within the next 5 years we need some kind of action plan to change systemic exercise and embed it within education, but also the workforce and whatever, where would that responsibility be? Like, do you envision this being a private enterprise that changes the way we live, like the Boring Project, or like another Elon Musk? Do we need someone like that to kind of change the way we think about the way we do like very fundamental things, or would you want to leave this to a government entity?
I think if I had a choice, I'd say both. Like, how do you affect change? It's not just one thing, it's lots of different factors coming together, right? So 100% we need a policy from the government. And if private enterprise wants to work on initiatives too, fantastic, right? Then we can get synergy on this. It needs to be a complete cultural overhaul.
Okay, and the last question, you had a question over here, or did you want to, or yes? Did you have a hand?
No, I have a hand.
Okay, go ahead,
I
please.
had two quick things.
Okay.
Enlightened employers do provide opportunities to exercise in the workplace. My son, he goes at 3 o'clock to take his break and, rolls like hell for 10 minutes, has a shower and back to work. The other thing is does anybody know what the Danish have done? Because I think they've been the most enlightened country dealing with aging. They've done specifically for the elderly and the aging. They've done things in small community level, my understanding, which includes social, exercise, continuing education. Anyway, and it's a very well accepted, it's paid for by the government, very well accepted. It's not as if the model isn't there.
Susanna?
Just a quick comment about that. So I showed you some data from a colleague of mine from Denmark. So we did a very similar experiment when we measured VO2 in the two populations, and theirs were 20% higher than all of ours.
Wow.
So we are, as a population, much fitter. And it was very interesting. There you go.
And on that one, we realized that we should be more Danish. I will not eat a Danish, eat Danish.
Well, we've had a wonderful day today on a marvelous topic, healthy aging, living forever, which will continue for a while. This is not a one-off, obviously, because we all age, but we've been entertained. We've had a wonderful discussion. We've had the introduction of the Jen Rossant lectureship, and we've had marvelous panels here to guide us with patient questions from the audience. So congratulations to all of you for both participating, hanging in, and elucidating an important topic, which I think has enriched both this environment and yourselves personally. It's my simple task to thank major people, the sponsors, of course, and it's the Faculty of Medicine, the Department of Medicine, Massey College, Friends of CIHR, and Diabetes Research and Treatment Center. I'd like to acknowledge the Junior Fellowship, particularly MGR, for supporting, participating. Arslan, Kinsha, thank you so much for all that you've done. And of course, Samir, who's been with us for quite a while, many years, and participated at many levels. Thank you so much. I've got the final task, of course, of rewarding our panelists with the prize of the day, the umbrellas, and I'll do that now. And enjoy this. It's a collector's item. And call for adjournment of this meeting. I should point out that the exchange has been recorded, audio recorded, and we'll get this transcribed and put on our website, MGR and Massey College. So thanks again for a wonderful Massey Grand Round Symposium.
Some of the but I want to talk about forever.
Okay, we'll have to stick around. I need to talk.